Chapter 801. 2 years. 2. Time passed differently now. I felt its shape in my bones, not just as moments ticking forward, but as the full weight of years compressed into insight. The kind of time that only made sense after you'd lost too much of it, or changed too much within it. 2 years, 730 days, exactly as Stella had calculated through her tears when I left. But those numbers felt hollow now, inadequate to measure what had passed between departure and return. On Zirion Prime, time had moved like honey through crystal, thick with purpose, sharp with consequence. Every hour spent fighting demon marquises, every day dedicated to mastering new techniques, every week pushing myself beyond what human flesh should endure. All of it had led to this moment, sitting in an Imperial car as Avalon City's familiar skyline drew closer through the glass. I looked at Empress Adeline, her presence as imperial as ever, poised and unreadable. Silver eyes that had witnessed decades of political maneuvering studied me with the kind of analytical precision that had made her legendary among continental rulers. Beside her, Emperor Quinn Slatemark radiated the kind of stillness that only came from surviving centuries and still not trusting them. I remembered them both too well, sharp memories carved into soft places. When I had returned to Avalon after my first year of magical training, I had still been a boy with a sword and too many plans. In front of Adeline, I had been helpless. Charming words meant nothing when she could see through masks like tissue paper. As for Quinn, even at peak ascendant rank, I hadn't been a match for him. His presence had dwarfed me then, his low radiant rank authority making my most impressive techniques feel like parlor tricks. But now the gap had narrowed into something almost poetic. The transport, an elegant, dark-paneled Imperial cruiser with mana-fused glass that shimmered faintly under the city's artificial skylight, glided through traffic patterns that parted automatically for Imperial privilege. There was enough space for a council meeting inside, but only 3 of us sat there. An empress, an emperor, and me. The silence hummed with unspoken assessments. Quinn turned, the crimson gleam of his eyes meeting mine as if scanning for something that shouldn't be there. His magical senses, refined through decades of ruling one of the world's most powerful empires, probed at my aura with the delicate precision of a master craftsman examining suspicious artwork. "I can't believe my eyes," he said finally, and when Quinn Slatemark said something like that, it wasn't flattery. "Unless I'm mistaken, you haven't reached Radiant yet." I held his gaze, letting him feel the edges of what I had become without revealing its full scope. No point bluffing here. These weren't opponents to be deceived. They were allies who needed to understand exactly what they were working with. "I haven't," I admitted. His eyebrows rose a fraction, an emperor's version of a gasp. "But still, your strength." He trailed off, the words evaporating before they made contact with meaning. "There were no precedents for this. I became strong enough," I said simply. That was all that mattered. The training on Zirion Prime hadn't just enhanced my magical capabilities. It had fundamentally rewritten my understanding of what power meant. Learning to kill beings that shouldn't die had given me perspective on what was truly worth protecting. Quinn didn't speak again for a while, though I could feel his analytical mind working through implications that probably disturbed him. Adeline, ever the tactician, had already calculated what my answer meant. She didn't ask what I had done. She didn't need to, because they both knew something I had made sure to show them, subtly but unmistakably. That I didn't return for ceremony or courtesy. I returned because the clock was ticking faster than most could hear. The Imperial Palace rose before us like a monument to human ambition, its crystalline spires catching the afternoon light while defensive barriers hummed with barely visible energy. But as our car approached the main courtyard, I saw something that made my enhanced senses pause with recognition that felt like coming home. They were all there, standing in formation that spoke to careful planning rather than casual gathering. Every person who mattered most to me waited in the palace's reception area. My enhanced vision picked out details that ordinary sight would miss. The way Rachel's golden hair caught the light as she maintained perfect saintess composure despite obvious anticipation. How Cecilia's imperial bearing couldn't quite hide the tension in her shoulders, The subtle way Rose and Serafina had positioned themselves to provide mutual support while Reika stood slightly apart with the kind of quiet intensity that characterized her approach to emotional moments. But it was the small figure at the front of the group that made my heart remember how to beat like a human organ again. Stella. No longer the 9-year-old child I had left behind, but an 11-year-old young woman whose mathematical precision had grown to encompass emotional calculations I could see in her carefully controlled expression. She stood with her chin raised, hands clasped behind her back in unconscious imitation of military posture, dark hair arranged with the kind of careful attention that suggested this moment mattered more to her than she was willing to admit. 730 days. She had counted every one. Your family requested permission to attend your return, Adeline said with gentle formality that couldn't quite hide maternal warmth. It seemed appropriate to grant such a request. The car slowly stopped with mechanical precision, but I barely noticed the subtle vibration as landing gear engaged. My attention was entirely focused on the group waiting beyond the vehicle's reinforced doors. 5 extraordinary women who had agreed to wait for someone who might return changed beyond recognition. Parents who had supported a son's decision to abandon them for power, and a daughter who had trusted that promises made by fathers who fought demons were promises that would be kept. The doors opened with hydraulic whispers, and I stepped out into afternoon air that carried the familiar scent of Avalon's magical infrastructure, mixed with autumn leaves and the distant promise of rain. But it was the sound that reached me first, Stella's voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably filled with emotion she was trying to manage through mathematical precision. 731 days, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the kind of absolute accuracy that had always characterized her approach to important calculations. You're 1 day late, Daddy. The gentle rebuke hit me harder than any marquee-level demon's attack had managed. But before I could formulate an apology that might begin to address 2 years of absence, she was moving, not running, but walking with determined purpose that closed the distance between us while maintaining the dignity she had clearly been practicing. I know, I said, kneeling to meet her at eye level as she approached with 11-year-old composure that couldn't quite hide the tears gathering at the edges of her vision. I'm sorry I was late. Did you become strong enough? She asked with the kind of direct honesty that only children possessed, studying my face with analytical precision that reminded me of her mathematical gifts applied to emotional assessment. Yes, I replied with absolute conviction, reaching out to pull her into a hug that felt like rediscovering gravity after floating in space for years. I became strong enough to keep all my promises. The embrace lasted exactly as long as it needed to, long enough for Stella to verify that her father had indeed returned as promised, short enough to maintain the public dignity that palace protocol demanded. But in those seconds, I felt something fundamental shift in my perspective. The training on Zirian Prime, the battles with demons, the final confrontation with an astral leviathan that could have swallowed continents. All of it had been preparation for this moment. Arthur, came Rachel's voice, warm with joy that had been carefully controlled for public display but couldn't be entirely contained. The 5 women approached with coordinated precision that spoke to months of planning this reunion, each maintaining appropriate diplomatic distance while their expressions carried emotions that transcended political necessity. Looking at them, at all of them, I felt the detachment that had characterized my perspective for 2 years finally dissolving into something approaching human warmth. These weren't abstract concepts to be protected from dimensional threats. They were people who had chosen to build their lives around someone who had disappeared into space with promises about returning stronger. My parents approached last, their expressions mixing relief with the kind of parental assessment that evaluated whether their son had returned intact despite obvious changes. The way they studied my face, searching for familiar features beneath whatever transformation training had wrought, reminded me that some bonds transcended even dimensional barriers. "Welcome home, son," my father said with businesslike efficiency that couldn't quite hide paternal emotion. "Welcome home, Arthur," my mother added with maternal warmth that had survived 2 years of uncertainty about whether her adopted son would actually return from his impossible journey. "Arthur," Cecilia said with royal authority that couldn't quite hide the relief flooding her crimson eyes. "Perhaps we should move this reunion somewhere more private? There are Developments you should know about before formal briefings begin. The suggestion carried undertones that made my enhanced senses immediately alert. Whatever had happened during my 2-year absence, it was significant enough to require careful explanation rather than casual discussion. But looking at the faces surrounding me, at Stella's careful composure, at the coordinated way my girlfriends had prepared for this moment, at my parents' obvious relief, I realized that no threat could matter more than this. The demons I had killed on Zirion Prime, the reality-bending techniques I had mastered, the final battle with Voidsinger May this that had nearly cost me my humanity. All of it had been worth enduring for this single moment of recognition that I had kept my promise to return. Standing there in the Imperial Palace courtyard, surrounded by autumn air and familiar faces, and the weight of responsibilities that felt meaningful rather than burdensome, I smiled with satisfaction that reached down to the core of my being. It had all been worth it. Chapter 802. 2 years, 3. The private reception hall felt smaller than I remembered, though nothing about its dimensions had changed. Perhaps it was because I had grown used to the vast crystal caves of Zirion Prime, or maybe because the people filling it now carried themselves differently. Taller, more confident, touched by power that hadn't been there when I left. Stella claimed her spot on my lap with the kind of determined efficiency that suggested she'd been planning this moment for months. At 11, she was getting too big for such things, but neither of us cared about dignity right now. Her small hands traced the new scars on my arms with curious precision. "You look different," she announced with typical directness. "Older, and you have more scars than before." 2 years fighting demons will do that, I replied, settling her more comfortably as the others arranged themselves around us. "But you look different too, taller, and your hair is longer." "I stopped cutting it," she said seriously. "Rachel told me you might like it this way when you came back." Rachel's cheeks colored slightly from her position across the room, but her sapphire eyes never left my face. There was something intense in her gaze, a hunger that went beyond mere affection. She had positioned herself where she could see me clearly, and I noticed how her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together. "I thought it would be nice," Rachel admitted, her voice carrying undertones that made my chest tighten. I thought about you every day, Arthur. Every single day." The simple exchange broke whatever formal tension had been building, but it also revealed currents beneath the surface. Suddenly everyone was moving closer, their careful positioning dissolving into something more desperate. Cecilia approached. Her crimson eyes held possessive fire that hadn't been there before. 2 years, she said softly, reaching out to touch my shoulder with fingers that lingered longer than necessary. 2 years of not knowing if you were alive or dead. Of wondering if you'd decided we weren't worth returning to. "Cecilia?" I began, but she pressed her fingers to my lips. "Don't," she said with quiet intensity. "Don't tell me you didn't consider staying wherever you went. Don't tell me you didn't think about how much simpler it would be without 5 complicated women and all the political mess that comes with us." The pain in her voice cut deep because part of what she said was true. There had been moments on Zirion Prime when the idea of never returning had crossed my mind. Moments when the simplicity of just surviving seemed easier than managing the complex web of relationships and responsibilities waiting for me. "I came back," I said simply, catching her hand and holding it firmly. "I always intended to come back." Rose had moved to my other side in a way that couldn't hide the emotion bleeding through her usual composure. "The Guild kept detailed records," she said with forced calm. "Every day you were gone. Every report we filed hoping for some sign you were still alive. I thought about expanding operations to other continents just to feel closer to wherever you might be." Her brown eyes held depths of worry that 2 years of uncertainty had carved into her usually confident demeanor. I could sense her power. High immortal rank, impressive beyond anything I had expected. But more than that, I could sense the exhaustion that came from carrying burdens alone. Serafina approached last, her ice-blue eyes reflecting control that was clearly costing her effort to maintain. "I trained every day," she said with characteristic directness. "Every technique, every form, until my body broke and I had to heal just to continue. Because if you came back wounded, if you needed protection, I wanted to be strong enough to stand beside you instead of behind you. Reika hadn't spoken yet, but she didn't need to. Her violet eyes said everything. Absolute devotion mixed with the kind of pain that came from loving someone who had vanished into the unknown. She positioned herself where she could touch my arm, and I felt her trembling slightly. "Tell us about where you went," she said with quiet intensity that carried years of suppressed fear. "We need to know what you faced. We need to understand what we were so afraid of losing you to." "Another world," I said, feeling Stella's complete attention focus on me with mathematical precision. "A place called Zirian Prime." The silence that followed was profound. Even my parents, who had supported my decision to leave, looked stunned at the confirmation. "The same summoning network the Order used could be reversed," I explained. "But only for someone with sufficient power, and only for a limited time." "What was it like?" Arya asked, though her 17-year-old curiosity couldn't hide deeper concern. "Crystal trees that sing. 2 suns, one yellow, one red. Air that tastes like metal because everything is saturated with magic." I shifted Stella slightly as memories surfaced. "And demons. 17 marquee-level demons that I had to hunt down one by one." 17? Rachel breathed, her sapphire eyes widening with something that looked almost like fascination. "You killed 17 immortal-rank demons by yourself." There was something in her tone, admiration mixed with a darker emotion that reminded me why some people found her intensity unsettling. She was imagining the battles, the violence, and finding it compelling in ways that went beyond professional interest. "The first few nearly killed me," I admitted. "I spent months learning how to fight opponents who used miasma instead of mana, who could corrupt reality itself with their presence." "But you survived," Cecilia said with possessive pride that made her earlier fear transform into fierce satisfaction. "You became strong enough to kill them all." "And then?" Rose asked. "Then I had to find a way home. But there was something blocking the path, an astral leviathan called Voidsinger Mathis, a creature the size of continents that had been guarding the planet for centuries." "What did you do?" Stella asked with scientific curiosity that reminded me why I had fought so hard to return to her. "I killed it." The words fell into absolute silence. Even Quinn, watching from his position near the windows, went completely still. "You killed an astral leviathan," Serafina repeated slowly, her strategic mind processing implications that clearly disturbed her. "It was blocking my path home," I said simply. "So I killed it." The battle lasted 3 days, but in the end, Voidsinger Mathis was dead and the way was clear. Rachel's breathing had grown shallow, her sapphire eyes bright with an intensity that bordered on fever. 3 days of fighting something that size," she whispered. "The power you must have, the techniques you had to develop." "Arthur," Reika said with quiet devastation, "you could have died, really died, with no way for us to help, no way for us to even know." The pain in her voice broke something in my chest. I could sense their power levels now. All 5 of them had reached high immortal rank, an achievement that should have been impossible in 2 years. But more than their strength, I could sense the emotional toll my absence had extracted. "I know," I said, pulling Reika closer while keeping my other arm around Stella. "I know what I put you through. But I had to become strong enough to protect what matters most." "We became stronger too," Cecilia said with quiet intensity. "All of us, because the alternative was sitting here helpless while you faced impossible odds alone." "I can sense it," I replied, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "High immortal rank. All of you, that's remarkable progress." "We had motivation," Rose said. "Knowing someone we love was fighting for his life on another world tends to accelerate development." "Love?" I repeated softly, the word carrying weight that felt both familiar and transformed by everything we had experienced. "Did you doubt it?" Rachel asked with the kind of dangerous quiet that reminded me why her devotion could be as terrifying as it was comforting. "Did you think 2 years would change how we feel about you?" "Sometimes," I admitted with honesty that made them all go still. "When the fighting was worst, when I thought I might not survive the next battle, I wondered if you'd move on. Find someone who could give you normal lives. Cecilia's response was immediate and fierce. Don't ever think that again, she said with imperial authority that brooked no argument. Don't ever imagine we'd choose normal over you. Don't ever doubt that we'd wait however long it took. Forever, Rekha added with simple conviction that held the weight of absolute truth. I missed you, I said, the words inadequate for everything I felt. Every day, every battle. You were what I fought to return to. We missed you too, Stella said with 11-year-old directness that cut through any pretense. But you're here now. That's what matters. My parents had been watching this emotional reunion with expressions that mixed relief with growing concern. My father cleared his throat carefully. Arthur, he said with precision that couldn't hide paternal worry, while we're all grateful for your return, there are developments that require immediate attention. The formal tone made everyone straighten slightly, warm reunion atmosphere giving way to something more urgent. What kind of developments? I asked, though something in the way they were all looking at me suggested the answer would be serious. Cecilia exchanged glances with the others before speaking with Crown Princess authority that made the air seem to sharpen around us. The kind that suggests your training might have been more necessary than we thought. Arthur, things have been building while you were gone. Threats that even our new power levels might not be sufficient to handle. How serious? I asked, already feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling back onto my shoulders. Serious enough that killing an astral leviathan might turn out to be exactly the kind of experience we need, Rose said with careful neutrality that couldn't hide underlying alarm. Stella shifted in my lap, clearly understanding that our reunion was about to be interrupted by whatever crisis had been building during my absence. Arthur, Cecilia said with royal gravity that made everyone in the room focus completely on her words. It's time we told you about the second calamity, and why we think it might be starting. Chapter 803, 2 years, 4. The first calamity. The heavenly demon. The name still echoed like an ancient curse across battlefields and textbooks alike. The single greatest disaster humanity had ever faced. A being that didn't just halt our ascent. She dismantled it, tearing the wings off humanity's golden age right as we were learning how to fly. In the records, a calamity was the designation given to a being who could threaten all of humanity, across every continent. To qualify, you needed to match a demigod in power at minimum. Only 2 humans had ever met that standard: Liam Kagu, the first hero and savior of the northern continent, and my master Magnus Drakkar, the martial king, the man who taught me how to fight and died before I could surpass him. I remembered the first time I heard whispers about the second calamity. Tiamat had told me, her voice grave despite her usual regal detachment. The great radiant dragon, perched atop the highest cliffs of the southern continent, had spoken of it with rare stillness in her golden eyes. It would come, she said, because of what I did. Because I saved Stella. I looked down at my daughter, who had grown quiet in my lap, her mathematical mind probably working through implications she was too young to fully grasp. Her dark hair fell across her face as she leaned against my chest, and I brushed it back gently. What signs have you seen? I asked, keeping my voice level while running my fingers through Stella's hair in the soothing pattern that had always helped her relax. Cecilia leaned forward, her imperial bearing evident even in casual conversation. Tiamat said it directly, and so did Queen Isolde, though she was more cryptic about the details. To you personally? I asked, noting how Stella's breathing was starting to slow as she fought sleep. To all superpowers, Cecilia said. They're being careful about information control. The moment news of a potential calamity becomes public, you'd have riots in Avalon and panic cults forming across all 5 continents. Smart. If I were managing the situation, I wouldn't go public either. Keeping things contained gave you time to prepare, time to build proper responses instead of reactive chaos. They want to form intercontinental coalitions, Rose added with businesslike precision that couldn't hide her underlying concern. Strengthen existing alliances and present a unified front when the time comes. Because that was the only way to face a calamity. Alone, you were dust. The energy signatures are scattered, Serafina reported with military efficiency. But there's been increased miasmic activity near borders. Nothing obvious enough to cause panic, but enough to suggest something is building. I nodded, processing the information while Stella's weight grew heavier against my chest as sleep finally claimed her. Her small hand was still clutching my shirt, even in unconsciousness, as if she was afraid I might disappear again. Stella stirred slightly in my arms, mumbling something about mathematical theorems before settling deeper into sleep. Looking at her peaceful face, I felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had driven me to face 17 marquises and kill an astral leviathan. She needs proper rest, my mother said with maternal wisdom, rising from her position on the couch. And you need time to process everything that's happened. My father stood as well, his business instincts recognizing that some conversations required privacy. The Guild's quarterly reports can wait until tomorrow, he said with gentle firmness. Tonight is for family. Arya approached to kiss my cheek with sisterly affection that had matured during my absence. I'm glad you're home, she said simply. Really glad. I carried Stella to the reception hall's attached rest area, settling her on the comfortable couch with a blanket that Rose had thoughtfully provided. She didn't wake during the transfer, her breathing deep and even with the total relaxation that came from feeling completely safe. Sleep well, sweetheart, I whispered, kissing her forehead gently. Daddy's here now. My parents and Arya left with quiet goodnights and promises to talk more in the morning, leaving me alone with the 5 women who had waited 2 years for this moment. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Whatever careful composure they had been maintaining for family propriety dissolved the moment the door closed. Rachel moved first, crossing the room with desperate speed that spoke to 2 years of suppressed need. Arthur, she breathed, throwing her arms around me with intensity that bordered on violence. Arthur, I thought, there were nights I was sure you were dead. Nights I could feel it in my bones that you weren't coming back. Her sapphire eyes were bright with tears she had been holding back, her usual saintess control completely abandoned as she pressed against me like she was trying to memorize my physical presence. Cecilia was next, her imperial dignity cracking as she wrapped her arms around both Rachel and me. 2 years, she said with voice breaking. 2 years of not knowing if you'd decided we weren't worth the complications. If you'd found something simpler on that other world. Never, I said firmly, pulling them both closer. Never even a possibility. Rose joined the embrace with businesslike efficiency that couldn't hide the trembling in her hands. The Guild reports were just excuses, she admitted against my shoulder. I wrote them because it felt like you were still part of daily operations. Like you might read them and remember us. Serafina approached last, her ice-blue eyes reflecting emotions she rarely allowed herself to express. I dreamed about you every night, she said with characteristic directness. Training scenarios where you came back injured and I wasn't strong enough to help. I pushed myself to high immortal rank because the alternative was imagining you needed protection I couldn't provide. Finally, Reika completed the circle, her violet eyes bright with tears that spoke to devotion that transcended normal human emotion. I counted every day, she whispered. 730 days of wondering if I'd ever see you again. Of wondering if loving you was the smartest or stupidest thing I'd ever done. Surrounded by all 5 of them, feeling their warmth and hearing their voices after 2 years of fighting alone on an alien world, I understood something fundamental about why I had survived everything Zirian Prime had thrown at me. I love you, I said simply, the words encompassing all of them. All of you. Every day I was gone, you were what I was fighting to return to. Show us, Rachel said with desperate intensity, her hands tracing the new scars on my arms. Show us you're really here. That this isn't just another dream where you disappear when we wake up. I kissed each of them in turn. Rachel with the passionate intensity she craved, Cecilia with possessive certainty that claimed and was claimed, Serafina with gentle respect that honored her reserved nature, Rose with steady affection that spoke to partnership, and Reika with devotion that transcended physical expression. I'm here, I said against Reika's lips as she clung to me with desperate strength. I'm home, and I'm not leaving again. Promise, Cecilia demanded with imperial authority that couldn't hide vulnerable need. I promise, I replied without hesitation. Whatever comes next, we face it together. We stood there in the quiet reception hall, holding each other with the kind of desperate relief that came from reunions that almost didn't happen. Outside, Avalon City hummed with normal evening activities, unaware that one of their protectors had returned from killing a guardian of the galaxy. The second calamity, Rose said eventually, her business mind reasserting itself even as she remained pressed against my side. Let's worry about that tomorrow, I said firmly. Tonight is about remembering why we're willing to fight world-ending threats in the first place. Looking around at these 5 extraordinary women who had chosen to wait for me, who had transformed themselves into forces of nature during my absence, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving Earth. Complete confidence. A calamity was coming. A being of ruin and myth, a world-ender with divine power and an ego to match. The kind of opponent that entire continents would struggle to stall, let alone defeat. I wasn't underestimating it. I knew better. But I also wasn't afraid, because I wasn't planning on fighting alone. Chapter 804, 2 years, 5. Despite everything I'd done, and the things I was now strong enough to do, I still had enough manners not to spend the night with all 5 of my fiancés in the Imperial Palace. Even I had limits. Even I had tact. So instead, I teleported us to my private penthouse. The one Reika maintained with obsessive precision, where every surface gleamed and every detail reflected the care she poured into creating a sanctuary for the people she loved. After tucking Stella into her room, her small body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of an emotionally overwhelming day, and getting down to business for hours, I stood in my bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror that had witnessed so many moments of my previous life. My eyes were a little more tired than I remembered. My jaw sharper. There was an edge to my face that hadn't been there before, carved by years of hunting demons in alien landscapes where mercy was a luxury that got you killed. The scars were subtle but present. Thin lines that spoke to blades that had come too close, burns that had healed imperfectly despite advanced magical treatment. I can't believe I did that, I muttered under my breath, though the words carried satisfaction rather than regret. Behind me, through the bedroom's open door, I could see them, all 5 of them, asleep together in the massive bed that had been designed to accommodate exactly this situation. Limbs tangled in silk sheets, peaceful expressions softening the exhaustion they rarely let anyone see during their waking hours. After 2 years apart, one thing had been painfully clear the moment we reunited. Distance had made everything sharper, not duller. And we'd all missed each other more than we had allowed ourselves to realize. Rachel lay curled against the pillows, her golden hair spread like sunlight across the dark fabric, one hand still reaching toward where I had been lying. Cecilia had claimed the center position with unconsciousness, her blonde hair a stark contrast against the pale sheets. Serafina maintained perfect posture even in sleep, though her silver hair had fallen across her face in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Rose had positioned herself near the edge, while Reika had somehow managed to curl into the smallest possible space despite the bed's generous proportions. They were warriors, leaders, heirs to great legacies that would shape the future of entire continents. But tonight, they had simply been women who wanted to hold the man they loved, to reassure themselves through touch that he had truly returned. I changed into clean clothes, the familiar fabric of home feeling strange against skin that had grown accustomed to the harsh textiles of an alien world. As I dressed, my eyes fell on my hands. Specifically, the 5 rings that gleamed on my fingers, each one pulsing faintly with traces of mana that spoke to promises made in bonds that transcended normal human relationships. But there was a 6th ring, one that I wore on a different finger. One that represented a promise I hadn't been able to keep. I reached for Alara's ring, the white etherite band that had been crafted to honor her healing abilities and the dignity she had deserved as my wife. The therapeutic energy woven into its structure still pulsed with gentle warmth, but now it felt like an echo of something lost rather than a connection to something present. She wasn't here. She would never be here again. But forgetting her wasn't the answer. Quite the opposite. I slipped her ring off my finger and threaded a silver chain through it, hanging it around my neck where it rested near my heart. The weight was slight but significant. A reminder of what sacrifice meant, of why the people still in my life mattered so much, of the price that had been paid for the power I now possessed. It wasn't about guilt. Guilt was useless. It was about purpose. Moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Avalon City, I looked out at the lights that sparkled like earthbound stars in the darkness. Millions of people living their lives, unaware that their continued existence depended on decisions made by individuals they would never meet. The weight of that responsibility had once felt crushing. Now it felt like gravity, constant, essential, and strangely comforting in its inevitability. And here, in this bed, 5 extraordinary women had chosen to wait for someone who might never have returned. They had transformed themselves into forces of nature during my absence, reaching power levels that should have taken decades to achieve, all because the alternative was feeling helpless while someone they loved faced impossible odds. Each of them was part of a constellation I could never allow to fall. The thought crystallized into something approaching absolute certainty. Yes, I knew they would fight beside me when the second calamity emerged. None of them were the type to wait quietly while I went to war against world-ending threats. But that didn't change my role. It didn't change what I had decided long ago, reinforced by every demon I had killed on Zirion Prime. I would be at the forefront. I would bear the brunt. I would take the heaviest steps first. Because I was the strongest now, by far. And I wasn't going to waste that advantage. There was a kind of quiet pride in that realization. Not the loud, arrogant kind that demanded recognition or applause. The deep kind. The kind that settled in your bones and let you sleep at night, knowing the people you loved were safe because you stood between them and everything else that wanted to hurt them. But before I could face whatever nightmare was gathering in the fragments of the heavenly demon's dispersed essence, there were older promises to keep. Debts that predated my journey to another world. Obligations that had been waiting patiently for my return. 1 week. I would give myself 1 week to reconnect with the life I had fought so hard to return to. 7 days to remember what normal felt like. To let Stella adjust to having her father back. To allow my parents and sister to process the changes 2 years had wrought in their son and brother. 7 days to explore how my relationships with 5 remarkable women had evolved during our separation. After that, duty called from the Western continent. Gene Ashbluff had been waiting years for me to repay him for his help I got using a mana oath. His sister Rin, corrupted by her innate miasmic gift, needed to be rescued before she would be executed and healed. Then there was Callie Malekith, whose family's grade 6 art had been stolen by the Savage Communion and the leverage I had used to get her help with building Ouroboros through Mana Oath. Most importantly, there was the Axe King, the Pope of the Savage Communion, leader of the cult that worshipped ogres. 8 years ago, I had challenged him to single combat to pique his interest in order to save Grand Marshal Malin Potton. He was delighted in seeing my talent and wished for me to fight him in 8 years. Now I was. The thought brought a smile to my lips that held none of the warmth I felt when looking at my sleeping fiancés. This was the smile of someone who had spent 2 years learning exactly how to kill opponents who should have been unkillable. The Axe King was powerful, low radiant rank, with decades of combat experience and magical artifacts that enhanced his already formidable abilities. But I had killed Voidsinger Mathis. I had slaughtered 17 marquises who specialized in forms of destruction that defied normal magical theory. I had awakened a third gift that allowed me to rewrite reality itself through narrative force. The Axe King would fall. Not easily, perhaps. Not without cost. But inevitably. And his defeat would send a message to every other threat gathering in the shadows. Arthur Nightingale had returned, and the world's protectors were no longer content to simply defend. We were taking the offensive. Planning already? Came Luna's amused voice in my mind, her presence gentle but alert. Most people take more than 1 night to readjust to domestic life. Most people don't have 17 demon marquee kills and a continental reputation to maintain, I replied silently, still watching the city lights below. Besides, You know as well as I do that the Western continent won't stabilize itself. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of someone stirring in the bed. Turning, I saw Reika's violet eyes reflecting the city lights as she watched me with the kind of patient attention that characterized her approach to everything important. "Can't sleep, master?" she asked softly, careful not to wake the others. "Just thinking," I replied, moving back toward the bed where she waited with arms already reaching to welcome me back into the warmth they had created together. "About what?" she asked as I settled beside her, automatically adjusting to accommodate my presence without disturbing the others. "About keeping promises," I said simply, pulling her close as exhaustion from an emotionally overwhelming day finally began to catch up with me. "About making sure this peace lasts." "It will," Reika said with absolute conviction that spoke to faith rather than mere hope. "Because you'll make sure it does." As sleep finally claimed me, surrounded by the people who made everything else worthwhile, I felt the kind of deep satisfaction that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the power to do it. Chapter 805, Western Continent 1. The first morning back felt like discovering a new form of magic. I woke to sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows and the soft sound of Stella humming mathematical sequences in the kitchen. Through our bond, Luna was practically purring with contentment. Apparently 2 years of demon fighting had made her appreciate domestic tranquility more than she cared to admit. "Daddy," Stella's voice carried from the kitchen with careful precision. "I made breakfast." Well, Reika helped, but I did the measurements. I found her standing on a step stool beside the counter, wearing an apron that was too big for her and concentrating with intense focus on arranging pancakes into geometric patterns. Reika stood nearby with violet hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, letting Stella take charge while providing subtle guidance. "Perfect circles," I observed, studying her work with genuine admiration. "And the spacing between them follows a mathematical progression." Stella beamed with pride that made my chest tighten with emotions I had forgotten could feel this powerful. I calculated the optimal arrangement for both aesthetic appeal and practical serving size. Rachel said the proportions would be more pleasing if I used the golden ratio. "Where is everyone else?" I asked, accepting the plate she handed me with ceremonial seriousness. "Rose went to handle guild business," Reika explained with gentle efficiency. "Cecilia had imperial obligations that couldn't wait. Serafina is training with the Eastern Embassy Guards, and Rachel is at the medical center treating overnight patients." They left. I felt an unexpected stab of disappointment that they hadn't stayed for breakfast. "They'll be back for lunch," Stella said with 11-year-old directness. "I made them promise. And tonight we're having family dinner with Grandma and Grandpa and Arya." The week that followed established a rhythm I hadn't experienced since before my magical training began. Mornings with Stella, who had appointed herself my guide to everything that had changed during my absence. Afternoons split between family time and catching up on guild operations. Evenings with all 5 women, sharing meals and conversation that gradually rebuilt the intimacy that 2 years of separation had strained. Stella had grown into someone remarkable during my absence. Her mathematical talents had evolved beyond mere calculation into genuine theoretical work that impressed university professors. But more than that, she had developed the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she understood her place in our unusual family structure and found it satisfying rather than confusing. "Tell me about the theorem you discovered," I said on the 3rd day as we walked through Avalon's Central Park, enjoying autumn weather that made the city feel like a painting. "It's not that complicated," she replied with modest precision, though her eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I noticed that magical resonance patterns follow predictable mathematical relationships. If you can calculate the base frequency of someone's mana signature, you can predict how they'll respond to different types of healing magic. And this helps with medical treatment?" Rachel says it reduced average recovery time by 30%. Stella confirmed with obvious pride. "But I think we can do better. I've been working on applications for emotional healing too, based on some of your research into trauma treatment." The casual way she referenced my work made me realize how much effort the others had put into keeping my memory alive during my absence. They hadn't just maintained the guild and our relationships. They had made sure Stella felt connected to a father who existed primarily in stories and promises. "I'm proud of you," I said, pulling her closer as we walked. "Really proud. You've become someone amazing while I was gone." "I had good teachers," she replied with the kind of serious gratitude that made me understand how much love and support she had received from the women who had chosen to help raise her. The guild headquarters felt both familiar and transformed when I finally made time to visit on the fourth day. The building itself was unchanged, but the scale of operations had expanded dramatically. Where once we had managed regional activities, now there were continental coordination centers and international liaison offices. "Sir," Elias greeted me in my office with professional pleasure that couldn't hide genuine relief at my return. "Welcome back. I trust you've found everything in order." "More than in order," I replied, studying the reports he had prepared with characteristic efficiency. "Expanded to every continent, partnerships with major noble houses, coordination agreements with political authorities I didn't even know existed. How did you manage all this?" Elias's expression carried pride mixed with respect for the others who had made it possible. "It wasn't just me, sir. Lady Reka provided the organizational framework and financial oversight. Prince Jean handled Western Continent negotiations. His family connections opened doors that would have remained closed to outsiders. And Lady Callie, well, her reputation for getting things done proved very persuasive with reluctant partners." "Show me the numbers," I requested, settling into my chair for what I suspected would be a comprehensive briefing. What followed was 2 hours of detailed reporting that demonstrated just how dramatically my absence had been turned into an advantage. Rather than letting the guild stagnate, my core team had used my reputation and their own capabilities to create something approaching a global organization. Every major guild on every continent now operates under Ouroboros coordination, Elias explained with quiet satisfaction. "Not ownership, partnership. They maintain their independence and cultural identity, but share resources, information, and strategic planning." "What about political pushback?" "Governments don't usually appreciate international organizations that operate independently. Jean and Callie handled most of those negotiations," Elias replied with obvious admiration. "Jin's family connections provided legitimacy in the Western continent, while Callie's direct approach convinced skeptics that cooperation was preferable to opposition." I could imagine what Callie's direct approach entailed. The Malekith family hadn't built their reputation through diplomatic niceties. "They did incredible work," I said with conviction that made Elias straighten with pride. "All of you did. I left you with a successful regional operation and came back to find a global network that most governments would envy." "Thank you, sir. Though I should mention that they specifically requested recognition for their efforts. Not public recognition, they understand the value of discretion, but personal acknowledgement from you." "They'll have it," I promised immediately. "Whatever they want. They've earned it." That evening, I made a point of thanking each person individually for what they had accomplished. Reka's response was characteristically modest, but I could see how much my appreciation meant to her. The others, reached through secure communication channels, expressed similar satisfaction at knowing their work had met my standards. On the 7th day, as I prepared for departure to the Western continent, Stella appeared in my office with the kind of determined expression that warned me she had come to a decision I probably wouldn't like. "I'm coming with you," she announced with certainty that left no room for argument. "Stella, the Western continent isn't safe right now," I began, but she cut me off with 11-year-old logic that was impossible to refute. "You said you wouldn't leave me again," she pointed out with devastating accuracy. "You promised. So either you break your promise, or I come with you." "This is different," I protested weakly. "This is dangerous work. There will be fighting." "There was fighting here too," she replied with reference to the Order's invasion 2 years earlier. "I survived that. Besides, you're strong enough to protect me now, aren't you?" The complete faith in her voice made arguing feel impossible. She had spent 2 years wondering if her father would return alive, and now she was unwilling to let him disappear again without knowing where he was going and what he was doing. "The others won't like this," I said, grasping for practical objections. I already asked them, Stella replied with the kind of thorough preparation that reminded me she had inherited more than just mathematical talents. Rachel said it would be good for me to see more of the world. Cecilia said travel broadens perspective. Serafina said I should learn to adapt to different environments. Rose said practical experience is the best education. And Rekha said she trusts your judgment completely. They set me up, I realized with growing admiration for their coordinated approach to family decisions. They love you, Stella corrected gently, and they understand that you need to keep your promises to me more than you need their permission. Standing in my office, looking at this remarkable young woman who had somehow become wise enough to manipulate adults while remaining innocent enough to believe in absolute honesty, I felt the last of my resistance crumble. Pack for 2 weeks, I said with resignation that carried undertones of pride. Practical clothes, study materials, and your mathematical journals. If you're coming, you're going to help with calculations and planning. Really? Her face lit up with excitement that reminded me why making her happy was worth almost any inconvenience. Really? But there are rules. You stay close to me at all times. You follow orders without argument. And if I say we're leaving, we leave immediately. I promise, she said with the kind of solemn oath that children made when they understood the seriousness of what they were agreeing to. That evening, as we prepared for departure, the 5 women gathered to see us off with expressions that mixed concern with understanding. They had all agreed to let me take Stella into potentially dangerous territory because they recognized that some bonds transcended normal safety considerations. Call us if you need anything, Cecilia said with imperial authority that made the offer feel like a command. Anything at all. We can be there in hours, Rachel added. Take care of each other, Rekha said with gentle intensity that encompassed both Stella and me. As our transport lifted off from the guild's private landing pad, I looked down at Avalon City's lights and felt the kind of complete satisfaction that came from knowing I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done with exactly the right person beside me. Daddy, Stella said as the city fell away beneath us. Yes. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep it. Chapter 806, Western Continent, 2. The sound of daggers clashing reverberated through the Ashbluff family's private training room as Jean and Callie separated, both breathing hard from their morning sparring session. The underground chamber was carved directly into the Western Continent's volcanic bedrock, its walls lined with protective wards that could contain even peak immortal rank combat without disturbing the manor above. Both weapons gleamed with deep dark energy that seemed to devour the room's magical lighting, creating shifting patterns of shadow and void that made tracking their movements a challenge even for enhanced senses. They moved with the kind of synchronized precision that spoke to months of training together, each anticipating the other's techniques with the intimacy that came from sharing both combat practice and more personal moments. Callie's fighting style was aggressive and unpredictable, her twin daggers weaving patterns that prioritized overwhelming offense over defensive positioning. She fought like someone who had learned that hesitation got you killed, every strike calculated to end conflicts quickly and decisively. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her eyes, while her combat attire was functional rather than decorative. Reinforced leather that could turn aside most magical attacks without sacrificing mobility. Jin's approach was more methodical, his movements flowing with the kind of controlled grace that came from noble training refined through practical application. Where Callie sought to dominate through speed and violence, Jean preferred to control the pace of engagement, using superior positioning and timing to gradually gain advantage. His dark hair was disheveled from exertion, but his breathing remained steady despite the intensity of their sparring. The final exchange was decisive. Jin's blade work had been gradually forcing Callie into increasingly disadvantageous positions, and when she committed to a particularly aggressive combination, he was ready. His counterattack flowed around her offense like water around stone, ending with his dagger pressed gently against her throat, while her own weapons were trapped in positions that couldn't threaten him. Yield, he said softly, though there was satisfaction in his dark eyes that went beyond mere victory in training. Your art is ridiculous, Callie scoffed as she stepped back, but her tone carried affection rather than genuine irritation. How the hell do you make defensive fighting look so damn elegant? You are strong too, Jean replied with characteristic understatement, his usually stoic expression softening with the kind of small smile that only appeared when they were alone together. Though perhaps you rely too much on aggression when patience would serve better. Patience is for people who have time to waste, Callie retorted, accepting the towel he offered with automatic courtesy. Some of us prefer to end fights before they become problems. Besides, she continued while wiping sweat from her forehead, your patience wouldn't have gotten us through half the political negotiations we handled during Arthur's absence. Sometimes you need to convince people that cooperation is their best option by demonstrating what happens if they choose otherwise. Jean chuckled quietly, the sound carrying warmth that transformed his usual serious demeanor. True, though your methods of persuasion occasionally created diplomatic complications that required considerable effort to resolve. But they worked, Callie pointed out with satisfaction that spoke to results rather than methodology. Every major guild in the Western continent now operates under Ouroboros coordination. The noble houses have agreed to resource-sharing protocols, and potential rivals decided that partnership was preferable to opposition. Their collaborative efforts during Arthur's absence had been remarkable in both scope and effectiveness. By the way, Jean said as they moved toward the training room's equipment storage, Arthur is finally coming to the Western continent. About time, Callie cursed with characteristic directness, though her tone carried relief alongside irritation. That bastard disappeared after the attack and comes back after 2 years like nothing happened. Despite her harsh words, Jean knew Callie had been genuinely worried about Arthur's well-being. When news of the Order's assault on Avalon had reached the Western continent, she had immediately prepared to travel there despite having no clear understanding of what assistance she could provide. Only Jin's calm reasoning and Arthur's own message explaining his departure had prevented her from charging across continents to help someone who was no longer there to be helped. I wonder how strong he is now, she continued with speculative interest that couldn't hide underlying concern. Knowing that bastard, it would be something completely ridiculous. Jean nodded in agreement, his dark eyes reflecting the same curiosity. Arthur had always possessed the kind of driven ambition that pushed normal limitations beyond their breaking points. 2 years of mysterious training, combined with whatever had motivated his departure, would likely have produced results that defied conventional expectations. Their relationship with Arthur had experienced a rocky, forced beginning. Political necessity had brought them together rather than personal choice, and early interactions had been characterized by mutual wariness and careful evaluation. Arthur's reputation for complex romantic arrangements had made Callie suspicious of his motives, while his obvious strategic intelligence had put Jean on guard against potential manipulation. But over time, those initial tensions had mellowed into something approaching genuine friendship. Arthur's willingness to honor commitments even when inconvenient, his obvious care for people who mattered to him, and his ability to separate personal relationships from political calculations had gradually won their respect and trust. More personally, working to support Arthur's interests during his absence had created the circumstances that allowed Jean and Callie's own relationship to develop beyond professional partnership. We should prepare for his arrival, Jean said as they made their way upstairs toward the manor's main living areas. Though I have to say, his timing could be better. You can say that again, Callie agreed with grim emphasis, her usual colorful vocabulary temporarily restrained by the seriousness of the situation. The Savage Communion has been mobilizing for months. Intelligence reports suggest they're planning something major, and the Axe King himself has been making appearances at strongholds that haven't seen him in decades. The political situation in the Western continent had grown increasingly unstable during Arthur's absence. The Savage Communion, a religious organization that worshipped strength above all else and followed ogre traditions that emphasized conquest and domination, had been expanding their influence through a combination of military pressure and theological conversion. Their pope, known as the Axe King, commanded respect through pure physical power that had remained unchallenged for generations. War is coming, Jean said with quiet certainty that reflected his family's intelligence networks. The question is whether Arthur's return will help stabilize the situation or accelerate it toward open conflict. Knowing Arthur? Callie replied with dark amusement. Probably both. They spent the next hour reviewing current intelligence reports and strategic assessments, preparing briefings that would bring Arthur up to speed on developments he had missed during his absence. The Western continent's political landscape had shifted dramatically, with traditional power structures being challenged by the Communion's aggressive expansion and their own efforts to create unified resistance. The timing really is shit, Callie observed as they worked through diplomatic correspondence that detailed growing tensions between various factions. Another few months and we might have had everything properly organized. As it stands, Arthur's arrival might force everyone's hand before we're ready. Perhaps that's for the best, Jean suggested with strategic thinking that had been refined through years of political maneuvering. Prolonged preparation sometimes creates more problems than immediate action. If conflict is inevitable, better to face it with Arthur's capabilities available rather than hoping the situation improves on its own. Before Callie could respond with what was undoubtedly going to be a creatively profane assessment of that logic, both of them went completely still as something massive and alien touched their magical senses. The sensation was like standing near a barely contained storm, power that operated on scales they had never encountered, authority that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. What the hell? Callie breathed, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapons despite knowing that whatever was approaching was far beyond anything blades could address. Jin's face remained stoic, but his dark eyes widened slightly as his enhanced senses tried to process what they were detecting. That's not possible. No one is that strong without being Radiant rank, and even then, the Manor's defensive wards, designed to detect and identify approaching visitors, suddenly chimed with recognition protocols that identified the impossible presence as someone with authorized access to Ashbluff family properties. Through the main hall's crystal windows, they could see a transport settling onto the landing pad with mechanical precision. The vehicle itself was unremarkable. Standard guild design with defensive enhancements that spoke to routine security considerations rather than special preparation for visiting dignitaries. But the figure that emerged from the transport's passenger compartment made both Jean and Callie forget how to breathe properly. Arthur Nightingale looked exactly as they remembered and completely different at the same time. His physical appearance was familiar, the same dark hair, the same blue eyes, the same confident bearing that had characterized his presence since their first meeting. But there was something else now, something that made their enhanced senses scream warnings about forces that transcended normal magical classifications. Jean! Callie! Arthur called out with genuine warmth as he approached the Manor's main entrance, a small figure walking beside him with obvious excitement. It's good to see you both again. The casual friendliness of his greeting created cognitive dissonance that made processing his presence even more difficult. This was someone who radiated power that could probably level mountains, having a normal conversation like nothing had changed. Arthur, Jean managed to reply, his usual stoic composure intact despite the circumstances. Welcome back. You bastard, Callie added with affection that couldn't hide her shock. You feel completely different. What the hell happened to you out there? Chapter 807, Western Continent, 3. I looked at Callie and Jean, a soft smile staying on my lips as I looked at my old friends who had helped me for years with my ambitions, bound together by the mana oath we had made so long ago. I got stronger, I responded simply, feeling Luna's amusement ripple through our bond. Understatement of the millennium, she snorted in my mind. You could probably level this entire continent if you put your mind to it. Of course I can see that, Callie said with characteristic directness. But just how is that even possible? Her dark eyes shifted down to Stella with obvious recognition. And look who got taller while I wasn't paying attention. Hello, Miss Callie, Stella said with polite precision, though her mathematical mind was clearly cataloging the changes in our surroundings. You look different too. Stronger. Callie's expression softened slightly. One of the few people who could manage that feat was standing right in front of her. Yeah, well, your dad left us with a lot of work to do. Had to get stronger or get crushed under all the political bullshit he dumped on us. Language, Jean said mildly, though there was affection in his stoic reprimand. She's 11, not 5, Callie retorted. Besides, if she's Arthur's daughter, she's probably heard worse. Actually, I keep my language quite clean around Stella, I said with amusement, settling into one of the manor's comfortable chairs while Stella claimed the spot beside me with practiced ease. Though I suspect she's learned some colorful vocabulary from her aunts. Aunt Rachel never curses, Stella said with mathematical precision. Aunt Cecilia only curses in 3 languages when she's really angry. Aunt Rose uses business terminology that sounds polite but is actually very insulting. Aunt Serafina curses in Eastern dialects that most people don't understand. And Aunt Reka doesn't curse at all. But she makes disappointed faces that are worse than any words. Callie's laugh was genuinely delighted. Damn, kid. You've got them all figured out. As we settled into more comfortable conversation, I let my enhanced senses examine Jean and Callie properly for the first time since arriving. What I found was impressive enough to raise my eyebrows with genuine surprise. High immortal rank, I said with appreciation that made both of them straighten slightly. Both of you. That's remarkable progress for 2 years. We had motivation, Jean replied with characteristic understatement, though I caught the pride beneath his stoic demeanor. And excellent reasons to get stronger fast, Callie added with darker undertones. Turns out that managing continental operations while preparing for war requires a certain level of personal power. Who knew? The Savage Communion? I asked, though I could already sense the tension that mention of the cult brought to both of them. Among other threats, Jean confirmed with diplomatic caution, the Western continent has become complicated during your absence. I nodded, having expected as much. Before we get into current politics, I said, meeting both their eyes with the kind of serious attention that made the air around us grow still. I need to address something more important, the mana oath we made years ago. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Both Jean and Callie went completely alert, their enhanced senses focusing on me with the kind of intensity that spoke to years of wondering whether this moment would ever actually arrive. You remember the terms, I continued, letting my voice carry the weight of absolute commitment. Jean, I promised to cure your sister Rin of her innate miasmic corruption. Something that should have been impossible with the power I possessed when we made that oath. And Callie, I swore to recover your family's stolen grade 6 art from the Savage Communion. Callie's expression shifted from hope to something approaching awe mixed with disbelief. You really think you can pull this off? Both promises. I don't think, I replied with absolute conviction. I know. Which brings us to more immediate concerns, I said, shifting the conversation toward current events. But first, congratulations on the engagement. I'm genuinely happy for both of you. About time someone mentioned it, Callie replied with affection that couldn't hide her pleasure at the recognition. Though I'm surprised you heard about it, considering you were busy killing things on another planet. It was announced publicly over a year ago, Jean said with mild amusement at my apparent surprise. Every major news network on every continent covered the story. The engagement between the Ashbluff heir and the daughter of the Malekiths was considered significant enough to warrant international attention. Reka mentioned it in her reports. I admitted with embarrassment at having missed such obvious information, though she was more focused on the political implications than the romantic aspects. The political implications were considerable, Jean confirmed with diplomatic understatement. Uniting 2 of the Western continent's most powerful magical lineages created alliance structures that several other noble houses found concerning. Good, I said with satisfaction that made both of them smile. Strong alliances make it easier to handle the kinds of problems that are coming. Stella, who had been listening to our conversation with obvious fascination, looked up at me with curious precision. Daddy, what's a mana oath? A magical contract that can't be broken, I explained, noting how both Jean and Callie tensed slightly at having to discuss such serious topics in front of her. When mages make promises using their mana as collateral, those promises become binding on a fundamental level. Breaking them would have severe consequences. Like what? She asked with scientific interest. Like losing the ability to use magic entirely, Callie said with characteristic directness. Or dying, depending on how the oath was structured. Oh, Stella processed this information with typical mathematical precision. So when you made promises to help Jean and Callie, you were really serious about keeping them. The most serious I've ever been about anything, I confirmed, pulling her closer while noting how the conversation had affected our hosts. Jin's expression had grown increasingly troubled as we discussed the feasibility of fulfilling our old agreements. Where Callie showed anticipation and savage satisfaction at the prospect of revenge, Jin's diplomatic training was clearly working through the broader implications of my enhanced capabilities. Arthur, he said with careful neutrality that couldn't hide underlying concern. When you say you can cure Rin and recover the Malekith art, you're talking about challenging institutions that have remained untouchable for decades. The kind of demonstration of power that reshapes how entire continents view authority and capability. Yes, I replied simply, understanding his concern but feeling no hesitation about the path ahead. That's... Jean paused, searching for diplomatic language to express thoughts that were clearly troubling him. That level of individual power historically creates instabilities that affect millions of people. Kings and emperors don't appreciate being overshadowed by subjects who can accomplish impossible things through personal strength alone. Before I could respond to his valid but ultimately irrelevant concerns, the Manor's communication systems activated with urgent tones that made everyone immediately alert. Jin's expression shifted from philosophical worry to immediate practical concern as he accessed the incoming message. "What is it?" Callie asked with the kind of tense readiness that suggested she was prepared for anything from assassination attempts to declarations of war. Jin's face went pale as he processed the information, his stoic composure cracking under whatever news he had just received. "My parents," he said with careful neutrality that couldn't hide significant apprehension. "Queen Camilla and King Valen are returning to the palace. They'll be here within the hour." The silence that followed was profound as everyone processed the implications of that announcement. "Shit," Callie said with feeling that perfectly captured the mood. Looking at my old friends' faces, I realized that my visit to the Western continent was about to become much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 808. Western Continent. 4. The royal plane cut through the evening sky with the smooth efficiency that only the finest magical engineering could provide. King Valen Ashbluff reclined in the luxurious cabin, his fingers absently swirling the remnants of golden tequila in his crystal glass. The soft glow of enchanted sconces bathed the private compartment in warm light, reflecting off the polished mahogany fixtures and the intricate royal insignia woven into the silk upholstery. Beside him, Queen Camilla Ashbluff rested her head against his shoulder, her auburn hair slightly disheveled from 3 exhausting days of border negotiations. Her green eyes held a delicate blend of diplomatic frustration and the bone-deep weariness that came from managing continental politics during wartime. "The northern houses proved as intractable as we expected," Valen said without preamble, taking a measured sip of his drink. The negotiations had been an exercise in diplomatic futility. 3 days of circular arguments that satisfied no one and resolved nothing. "General Rothschild continues pushing for territorial concessions we cannot afford to grant," Camilla replied with a weary sigh. "While General Blackwater seems more interested in positioning himself for whatever comes after the war than actually preparing to fight it." Valen's gray eyes hardened with the cold determination that had unified the Western continent under his rule. "They don't understand that there may not be an after if we continue this pattern of delays and half measures. Fear has paralyzed them when decisive action is what's needed." "Fear of the savage communion's growing strength," Camilla murmured, her voice carrying the weight of countless intelligence reports detailing cult expansion across their lands. The plane's communication system chimed softly, indicating their approach to the capital. Through the enchanted windows, the lights of the royal city sprawled below them like scattered diamonds against dark velvet, the familiar sight of home doing little to ease the tension that had settled over both monarchs. "At least the war preparations continue to advance," Camilla said, attempting to inject some optimism into their increasingly grim assessment. "Jin's progress has been exceptional. His engagement to the Malekith girl has proven both personally fulfilling and politically advantageous. High immortal rank at their age. Valen agreed, genuine paternal pride breaking through his diplomatic composure. Both Jean and Callie have achieved power levels that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago. Their combined strength will be crucial in the coming conflict. Callie has exceeded all expectations, Camila added with careful diplomatic language that couldn't hide her growing respect for their son's fiancé. Her methods may be direct, but they're undeniably effective. The conversation lulled as both rulers gazed out at their approaching kingdom, each lost in contemplation of the challenges that awaited them. The weight of leadership during wartime pressed against their shoulders like a familiar burden that never truly lifted, a constant reminder of the millions of lives that depended on their decisions. The preparations are proceeding smoothly, Valen continued after a moment. Our forces grow stronger each month, and the continental alliances are finally beginning to solidify. Soon, we'll have the unified strength necessary to crush the cults permanently. And yet, Camila said quietly, her voice barely audible above the transport's engines, we still face the greatest threat of all. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. Valen's expression darkened, the casual warmth evaporating like morning mist under harsh sunlight. They both knew exactly what she meant, the one danger that overshadowed even the savage communion's growing power. Rin, he said simply, the name carrying weight that spoke to sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Camila's fingers tightened on his arm, maternal anguish bleeding through her royal composure. She's growing stronger, Valen. The seals that contain her, they won't hold much longer. I know. Valen's voice carried the bitter acceptance of a man who had wrestled with an unsolvable problem for too long. My own power was barely sufficient to create the containment barriers in the first place. As she continues to develop, the energy differential becomes increasingly unstable. How long? Camila asked, though she already knew the answer would offer no comfort. 6 months. Valen replied with clinical precision that couldn't hide his underlying dread. Perhaps less. Soon, she'll reach the level where breaking free will no longer be a question of if, but when. The royal transport began its descent toward the palace landing platforms, the familiar towers and spires of their ancestral home growing larger through the windows. Neither monarch took comfort in the sight. Not when they knew what waited in the deepest, most heavily warded chambers beneath those ancient stones. The world cannot know, Camila whispered, voicing the fear that haunted their every waking moment. If the other continental rulers discovered what we're hiding, they would unite against us immediately, Valen finished grimly. She's our daughter, Camila said desperately, tears threatening to spill from eyes that had witnessed too much loss already. She was our daughter, Valen corrected with brutal finality that made his wife flinch. What she's becoming is not human anymore, Camila. The power that's been growing inside her, feeding on itself, amplifying beyond all natural limits. That's not our child. That's a weapon capable of destroying continents. There has to be another way, Camila pleaded, clinging to hope with the desperation of a mother watching her child slip away. Some solution that doesn't require. What? Valen's voice cracked like a whip, his warrior's temperament bleeding through diplomatic control. What solution exists for containing power that will soon eclipse my own? What prison could hold someone capable of reshaping reality through sheer force of will? I don't know, Camila admitted, her voice breaking slightly, but I can't accept that killing her is our only option. Valen's expression softened marginally, paternal love warring with the cold pragmatism that had kept their kingdom intact through 2 decades of increasingly deadly threats. Neither can I, he said quietly. But we may not have a choice. Jean is our heir, our continent's future. I will not risk his life, or the lives of our people, for someone who is already lost to us. Lost according to projections that might be wrong, Camila said with fading hope. What if there are containment methods we haven't considered? What if someone exists with the power to help us find another solution? Who? Valen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew no such person existed. What individual possesses the strength necessary to contain or redirect power of that magnitude? Before Camilla could respond, Valen's enhanced senses suddenly snapped to attention, his entire body going rigid with alertness that spoke to decades of surviving in a world where political miscalculation meant death. The casual conversation died as something immense pressed against the boundaries of his perception. A presence so overwhelming it made his carefully maintained mental shields strain under the pressure. "Someone extraordinarily powerful is in the palace," he said quietly, setting down his glass with careful precision that spoke to suddenly heightened danger awareness. Camilla frowned, her own considerable magical abilities reaching out to assess the situation developing below them. One of the generals arriving for unscheduled negotiations? No. Valen's voice carried growing wonder mixed with genuine disbelief. Much stronger than any of them. Stronger than anyone I've encountered in recent memory. The presence continued to build, layer upon layer of controlled power that spoke to capabilities far beyond anything the Western continent had seen in living memory. It was like sensing the sun descending to Earth, impossible to ignore and fundamentally unsettling in its implications for the established order. The Axe King launching some kind of direct assault? Camilla asked with rising alarm, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios involving cult infiltration of their capital city. Far stronger than him, Valen breathed, his warrior instincts automatically cataloging the approaching power while his analytical mind struggled to process what his enhanced senses were detecting. And then recognition dawned like lightning splitting a dark sky, bringing with it memories of a stubborn black-haired boy who had nearly passed impossible trials through sheer determination alone. "Arthur Nightingale," Valen said with something approaching reverence. That remarkable young man who refused to accept defeat even when facing challenges far beyond his capabilities. The royal plane completed its final approach to the palace landing platforms, the city lights now blazingly bright as they prepared to touch down. Camilla gasped as the full weight of the approaching presence finally registered on her consciousness, her enhanced senses struggling to process power levels that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "This strength," she whispered in awe. "How is such growth possible in just 6 years?" "I don't know," Valen admitted, his voice carrying genuine wonder at what Arthur had apparently become during his absence. "But his return might change everything we thought we knew about the problems facing our continent." The transport settled onto the landing platform with practiced precision, magical stabilizers ensuring smooth arrival despite the tremendous energies swirling through the area. Through the cabin windows, they could see the familiar architecture of their ancestral home, now serving as backdrop to a reunion that could reshape their kingdom's future in ways neither monarch could predict. "He's here," Valen said unnecessarily, his voice carrying complex emotions that ranged from genuine pleasure at seeing an old friend to deep apprehension about what this meeting might mean for their carefully guarded secrets. Camilla straightened her formal attire, adopting the regal bearing expected of a queen even as her heart raced with possibility and fear. "The boy who impressed you so greatly years ago has returned as something approaching a force of nature," Valen finished, rising from his seat as the transport's doors prepared to open. "Whatever Arthur Nightingale has become, our kingdom will never be the same." The reunion was about to begin, and neither ruler could predict whether it would bring salvation or catastrophe to the secrets they had guarded so carefully. Chapter 809, Western Continent, 5. The grand doors of the manor's main hall opened with ceremonial precision, and Valen and Camilla Ashbluff, the king and queen of the Western Continent, entered the room together. Their presence immediately transformed the atmosphere, filling the space with the kind of authority that could only come from decades of ruling one of the world's most powerful nations. Camilla moved with the fluid grace of someone who had mastered both political diplomacy and personal combat. Her auburn hair was arranged in the intricate braids befitting a queen, while her green eyes missed nothing as they swept across the room. I could sense her power immediately, high immortal rank, just slightly below Jean and Callie's current level. Impressive for someone who had never been primarily focused on martial advancement, choosing instead to balance royal duties with personal strength. But it was Valen who truly commanded attention. The king of the Western continent had always been formidable, but the man who stood before me now had clearly grown even stronger in the years since our last meeting. Mid-radiant rank power radiated from him like controlled sunlight, making the very air around him shimmer with barely contained energy. He had broken through from his previous level, ascending to become not just the strongest ruler in the Western continent, but the most powerful king in the entire world. The current rank 1. Looking at him now, memories flooded back to that winter break during my second year at Mythos Academy. I had been struggling against the aspect wall, frustrated by my inability to progress beyond the limitations that seemed to define my magical development. Valen had tested me then, pushing me to my absolute limits with trials that had seemed impossibly difficult for someone of my capabilities. Back then, he had represented the absolute pinnacle of what magical achievement could look like. The thought of reaching his level, let alone surpassing it, had seemed like an impossible dream, something so far beyond my potential that even considering it felt like delusion. He had also been the one to later award my guild that generous contract, opening the doors for our operations in the Western continent when other rulers might have been more cautious about allowing foreign magical organizations to establish footholds in their territory. The absolute, perfect necromancer talent. Standing here now, I could feel how dramatically the balance of strength had shifted. Where once Valen's presence had been overwhelming, now I could sense his power clearly without feeling dwarfed by it. The impossible had become reality. I had not only reached his level but transcended it entirely. Arthur Nightingale, Valen said with genuine warmth that couldn't hide his careful assessment of the changes in my capabilities. Welcome back to the Western continent. Your Majesties, I replied with respectful acknowledgement, noting how both rulers were working to process the reality of my enhanced power. Thank you for your hospitality. The pleasure is entirely ours, Camilla said with diplomatic grace that carried undertones of genuine curiosity. Jean and Callie have spoken of you often during your absence. We've been eager to see how you've developed. Her careful choice of words spoke to the political sensitivity of my return. Having someone of my apparent strength appear in their kingdom without warning represented both opportunity and potential threat, depending on my intentions and loyalties. Perhaps we might continue this conversation over dinner? Valen suggested with the kind of casual authority that made his words sound like invitations while functioning as commands. I'm sure you have stories to share about your travels. The dining hall of the Ashbluff Manor was a masterpiece of understated elegance, with enchanted chandeliers casting warm light over a table that could easily accommodate a dozen guests. Tonight, however, it was set for a more intimate gathering. Myself, Stella, Jean, Callie, and the royal couple, creating an atmosphere that balanced formality with family warmth. Stella sat beside me with the kind of perfect posture that spoke to years of careful instruction, her black eyes taking in every detail of the royal dining experience with obvious fascination. She had met nobility before, of course, but never rulers of this magnitude, and her mathematical mind was clearly cataloging the subtle protocols and ceremonial elements that defined royal hospitality. So, Valen said as the first course was served by silent, efficiently moving servants, tell us about your disappearance after the Order's attack on Avalon City. The mention of that catastrophic event brought a momentary silence to the table. The assault on the Slatemark Empire's capital had been one of the most devastating magical attacks in recent history, leaving thousands dead and fundamentally altering the political landscape of the world. The attack itself was more severe than most people realize. I began carefully, aware that my answer would be analyzed for both factual content and political implications. The only reason the damage was limited was because of Lady Alara Astoria and Archduke Leopold Astoria's sacrifice. The reports suggested significant demonic involvement, Camilla said with the kind of precise diplomatic language that invited elaboration without demanding it. A demon duke, I confirmed, noting how Jean and Callie leaned forward slightly at this revelation. The Order had somehow managed to summon a demon duke to Earth. Archduke sacrificed himself to kill the duke, and so did Alara, but to save millions of lives. After which, I made a decision. To get stronger, Valen asked. Exactly. Which is why I made the decision to investigate the other end of that connection. I paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle before continuing. I reversed the summoning process and used their own dimensional bridge to travel to a planet ruled by demons. The silence that followed was profound. Even in a world where impossible magical feats occurred regularly, the idea of deliberately traveling to one of the demon realms represented a level of risk that bordered on suicidal insanity. Training against demons, Valen said with growing understanding of how I had achieved such dramatic advancement in seemingly impossible timeframes. 17 demon marquises, I replied, noting how even Valen's impressive composure showed cracks at that number. Each battle pushed me closer to the edge of survival, forcing adaptations and breakthroughs that normal magical development could never achieve. And now you've returned, Camilla said with careful neutrality that invited explanation of my future intentions. I have debts to honor, I replied simply. Promises made years ago that I finally have the power to fulfill. Valen's expression grew thoughtful, his senses no doubt picking up on the subtle but unmistakable determination in my voice. As someone who understood the weight of absolute commitment, he would recognize the kind of resolve that brooked no compromise or delay. The guild operations you established before your departure have continued to flourish, he said, shifting the conversation toward more immediately practical matters. Your organization's reputation for handling problems that conventional approaches cannot solve has made them quite valuable to various continental governments. I'm pleased to hear that, I replied genuinely, though I suspect the real challenges are just beginning. The war preparations, you mean? Camilla asked with the kind of carefully controlled tension that spoke to months of strategic planning and resource allocation. Among other things, I said, meeting both rulers' eyes with the kind of serious attention that made the air around us grow still. The cults represent a significant threat, certainly. But sometimes the most dangerous problems are the ones that never make it into public knowledge. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Both Valen and Camilla went completely alert, their diplomatic training clearly recognizing that our conversation had just shifted into territory that required extreme caution. Public knowledge can be limiting when it comes to certain sensitive matters, Valen said with neutral diplomatic language that neither confirmed nor denied anything specific. Indeed, I agreed, noting how Jean and Callie had also tensed slightly, their enhanced senses picking up on the undercurrents of a conversation that was rapidly approaching topics of critical importance. I took a measured sip of wine, allowing the moment to build before delivering the words that would change everything about this reunion. I know about Rin, I said quietly, meeting Valen's suddenly sharp gaze with absolute certainty. I can save her. Chapter 807, Western Continent, 3. I looked at Callie and Jean, a soft smile staying on my lips as I looked at my old friends who had helped me for years with my ambitions, bound together by the mana oath we had made so long ago. I got stronger, I responded simply, feeling Luna's amusement ripple through our bond. Understatement of the millennium, she snorted in my mind. You could probably level this entire continent if you put your mind to it. Of course I can see that, Callie said with characteristic directness. But just how is that even possible? Her dark eyes shifted down to Stella with obvious recognition. And look who got taller while I wasn't paying attention. Hello, Miss Callie, Stella said with polite precision, though her mathematical mind was clearly cataloging the changes in our surroundings. You look different too. Stronger. Callie's expression softened slightly. One of the few people who could manage that feat was standing right in front of her. Yeah, well, your dad left us with a lot of work to do. Had to get stronger or get crushed under all the political bullshit he dumped on us. Language, Jean said mildly, though there was affection in his stoic reprimand. She's 11, not 5, Callie retorted. Besides, if she's Arthur's daughter, she's probably heard worse. Actually, I keep my language quite clean around Stella, I said with amusement, settling into one of the manor's comfortable chairs while Stella claimed the spot beside me with practiced ease. Though I suspect she's learned some colorful vocabulary from her aunts. Aunt Rachel never curses, Stella said with mathematical precision. Aunt Cecilia only curses in 3 languages when she's really angry. Aunt Rose uses business terminology that sounds polite but is actually very insulting. Aunt Serafina curses in Eastern dialects that most people don't understand. And Aunt Reka doesn't curse at all, but she makes disappointed faces that are worse than any words. Callie's laugh was genuinely delighted. Damn, kid, you've got them all figured out. As we settled into more comfortable conversation, I let my enhanced senses examine Jean and Callie properly for the first time since arriving. What I found was impressive enough to raise my eyebrows with genuine surprise. High immortal rank, I said with appreciation that made both of them straighten slightly. Both of you, that's remarkable progress for 2 years. We had motivation, Jean replied with characteristic understatement, though I caught the pride beneath his stoic demeanor. And excellent reasons to get stronger fast, Callie added with darker undertones. Turns out that managing continental operations while preparing for war requires a certain level of personal power. Who knew? The Savage Communion? I asked, though I could already sense the tension that mention of the cult brought to both of them. Among other threats, Jean confirmed with diplomatic caution, the Western continent has become complicated during your absence. I nodded, having expected as much. Before we get into current politics, I said, meeting both their eyes with the kind of serious attention that made the air around us grow still, I need to address something more important, the mana oath we made years ago. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Both Jean and Callie went completely alert, their enhanced senses focusing on me with the kind of intensity that spoke to years of wondering whether this moment would ever actually arrive. You remember the terms, I continued, letting my voice carry the weight of absolute commitment. Jean, I promised to cure your sister Rin of her innate miasmic corruption. Something that should have been impossible with the power I possessed when we made that oath. And Callie, I swore to recover your family's stolen grade 6 art from the Savage Communion. Callie's expression shifted from hope to something approaching awe mixed with disbelief. You really think you can pull this off? Both promises. I don't think, I replied with absolute conviction. I know. Which brings us to more immediate concerns, I said, shifting the conversation toward current events. But first, congratulations on the engagement. I'm genuinely happy for both of you. About time someone mentioned it, Callie replied with affection that couldn't hide her pleasure at the recognition. Though I'm surprised you heard about it, considering you were busy killing things on another planet. It was announced publicly over a year ago, Jean said with mild amusement at my apparent surprise. Every major news network on every continent covered the story. The engagement between the Ashbluff heir and the daughter of the Malekiths was considered significant enough to warrant international attention. Reka mentioned it in her reports. I admitted with embarrassment at having missed such obvious information, though she was more focused on the political implications than the romantic aspects. The political implications were considerable, Jean confirmed with diplomatic understatement. Uniting two of the Western continent's most powerful magical lineages created alliance structures that several other noble houses found concerning. Good, I said with satisfaction that made both of them smile. Strong alliances make it easier to handle the kinds of problems that are coming. Stella, who had been listening to our conversation with obvious fascination, looked up at me with curious precision. Daddy, what's a mana oath? A magical contract that can't be broken, I explained, noting how both Jean and Callie tensed slightly at having to discuss such serious topics in front of her. When mages make promises using their mana as collateral, those promises become binding on a fundamental level. Breaking them would have severe consequences. Like what? She asked with scientific interest. Like losing the ability to use magic entirely, Callie said with characteristic directness. Or dying, depending on how the oath was structured. Oh, Stella processed this information with typical mathematical precision. So when you made promises to help Jean and Callie, you were really serious about keeping them. The most serious I've ever been about anything, I confirmed, pulling her closer while noting how the conversation had affected our hosts. Jin's expression had grown increasingly troubled as we discussed the feasibility of fulfilling our old agreements. Where Callie showed anticipation and savage satisfaction at the prospect of revenge, Jin's diplomatic training was clearly working through the broader implications of my enhanced capabilities. Arthur, he said with careful neutrality that couldn't hide underlying concern. When you say you can cure Rin and recover the Malekith art, you're talking about challenging institutions that have remained untouchable for decades. The kind of demonstration of power that reshapes how entire continents view authority and capability. Yes, I replied simply, understanding his concern but feeling no hesitation about the path ahead. That's... Jean paused, searching for diplomatic language to express thoughts that were clearly troubling him. That level of individual power historically creates instabilities that affect millions of people. Kings and emperors don't appreciate being overshadowed by subjects who can accomplish impossible things through personal strength alone. Before I could respond to his valid but ultimately irrelevant concerns, the Manor's communication systems activated with urgent tones that made everyone immediately alert. Jin's expression shifted from philosophical worry to immediate practical concern as he accessed the incoming message. "What is it?" Callie asked with the kind of tense readiness that suggested she was prepared for anything from assassination attempts to declarations of war. Jin's face went pale as he processed the information, his stoic composure cracking under whatever news he had just received. "My parents," he said with careful neutrality that couldn't hide significant apprehension. "Queen Camilla and King Valen are returning to the palace. They'll be here within the hour." The silence that followed was profound as everyone processed the implications of that announcement. "Shit," Callie said with feeling that perfectly captured the mood. Looking at my old friends' faces, I realized that my visit to the Western continent was about to become much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 808. Western Continent. 4. The royal plane cut through the evening sky with the smooth efficiency that only the finest magical engineering could provide. King Valen Ashbluff reclined in the luxurious cabin, his fingers absently swirling the remnants of golden tequila in his crystal glass. The soft glow of enchanted sconces bathed the private compartment in warm light, reflecting off the polished mahogany fixtures and the intricate royal insignia woven into the silk upholstery. Beside him, Queen Camilla Ashbluff rested her head against his shoulder, her auburn hair slightly disheveled from 3 exhausting days of border negotiations. Her green eyes held a delicate blend of diplomatic frustration and the bone-deep weariness that came from managing continental politics during wartime. "The northern houses proved as intractable as we expected," Valen said without preamble, taking a measured sip of his drink. The negotiations had been an exercise in diplomatic futility. 3 days of circular arguments that satisfied no one and resolved nothing. "General Rothschild continues pushing for territorial concessions we cannot afford to grant," Camilla replied with a weary sigh. "While General Blackwater seems more interested in positioning himself for whatever comes after the war than actually preparing to fight it." Valen's gray eyes hardened with the cold determination that had unified the Western continent under his rule. "They don't understand that there may not be an after if we continue this pattern of delays and half measures. Fear has paralyzed them when decisive action is what's needed." "Fear of the savage communion's growing strength," Camilla murmured, her voice carrying the weight of countless intelligence reports detailing cult expansion across their lands. The plane's communication system chimed softly, indicating their approach to the capital. Through the enchanted windows, the lights of the royal city sprawled below them like scattered diamonds against dark velvet, the familiar sight of home doing little to ease the tension that had settled over both monarchs. "At least the war preparations continue to advance," Camilla said, attempting to inject some optimism into their increasingly grim assessment. "Jin's progress has been exceptional. His engagement to the Malekith girl has proven both personally fulfilling and politically advantageous. High immortal rank at their age," Valen agreed, genuine paternal pride breaking through his diplomatic composure. "Both Jean and Callie have achieved power levels that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago. Their combined strength will be crucial in the coming conflict." "Callie has exceeded all expectations," Camilla added with careful diplomatic language that couldn't hide her growing respect for their son's fiancé. "Her methods may be direct, but they're undeniably effective. The conversation lulled as both rulers gazed out at their approaching kingdom, each lost in contemplation of the challenges that awaited them. The weight of leadership during wartime pressed against their shoulders like a familiar burden that never truly lifted, a constant reminder of the millions of lives that depended on their decisions. The preparations are proceeding smoothly, Valen continued after a moment. Our forces grow stronger each month, and the continental alliances are finally beginning to solidify. Soon, we'll have the unified strength necessary to crush the cults permanently. And yet, Camilla said quietly, her voice barely audible above the transport's engines, we still face the greatest threat of all. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. Valen's expression darkened, the casual warmth evaporating like morning mist under harsh sunlight. They both knew exactly what she meant, the one danger that overshadowed even the Savage Communion's growing power. Rin, he said simply, the name carrying weight that spoke to sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Camilla's fingers tightened on his arm, maternal anguish bleeding through her royal composure. She's growing stronger, Valen. The seals that contain her, they won't hold much longer. I know. Valen's voice carried the bitter acceptance of a man who had wrestled with an unsolvable problem for too long. My own power was barely sufficient to create the containment barriers in the first place. As she continues to develop, the energy differential becomes increasingly unstable. How long? Camilla asked, though she already knew the answer would offer no comfort. 6 months, Valen replied with clinical precision that couldn't hide his underlying dread. Perhaps less. Soon, she'll reach the level where breaking free will no longer be a question of if, but when. The royal transport began its descent toward the palace landing platforms, the familiar towers and spires of their ancestral home growing larger through the windows. Neither monarch took comfort in the sight. Not when they knew what waited in the deepest, most heavily warded chambers beneath those ancient stones. The world cannot know, Camilla whispered, voicing the fear that haunted their every waking moment. If the other continental rulers discovered what we're hiding, they would unite against us immediately, Valen finished grimly. She's our daughter, Camilla said desperately, tears threatening to spill from eyes that had witnessed too much loss already. She was our daughter, Valen corrected with brutal finality that made his wife flinch. What she's becoming is not human anymore, Camilla. The power that's been growing inside her, feeding on itself, amplifying beyond all natural limits. That's not our child. That's a weapon capable of destroying continents. There has to be another way, Camilla pleaded, clinging to hope with the desperation of a mother watching her child slip away. Some solution that doesn't require. What? Valen's voice cracked like a whip, his warrior's temperament bleeding through diplomatic control. What solution exists for containing power that will soon eclipse my own? What prison could hold someone capable of reshaping reality through sheer force of will? I don't know, Camilla admitted, her voice breaking slightly, but I can't accept that killing her is our only option. Valen's expression softened marginally, paternal love warring with the cold pragmatism that had kept their kingdom intact through 2 decades of increasingly deadly threats. Neither can I, he said quietly. But we may not have a choice. Jean is our heir, our continent's future. I will not risk his life, or the lives of our people, for someone who is already lost to us. Lost according to projections that might be wrong, Camilla said with fading hope. What if there are containment methods we haven't considered? What if someone exists with the power to help us find another solution? Who? Valen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew no such person existed. What individual possesses the strength necessary to contain or redirect power of that magnitude? Before Camilla could respond, Valen's enhanced senses suddenly snapped to attention, his entire body going rigid with alertness that spoke to decades of surviving in a world where political miscalculation meant death. The casual conversation died as something immense pressed against the boundaries of his perception, a presence so overwhelming it made his carefully maintained mental shields strain under the pressure. Someone extraordinarily powerful is in the palace. he said quietly, setting down his glass with careful precision that spoke to suddenly heightened danger awareness. Camilla frowned, her own considerable magical abilities reaching out to assess the situation developing below them. One of the generals arriving for unscheduled negotiations? No. Valen's voice carried growing wonder mixed with genuine disbelief. Much stronger than any of them. Stronger than anyone I've encountered in recent memory. The presence continued to build, layer upon layer of controlled power that spoke to capabilities far beyond anything the Western continent had seen in living memory. It was like sensing the sun descending to Earth, impossible to ignore and fundamentally unsettling in its implications for the established order. The Axe King launching some kind of direct assault? Camilla asked with rising alarm, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios involving cult infiltration of their capital city. Far stronger than him, Valen breathed, his warrior instincts automatically cataloging the approaching power while his analytical mind struggled to process what his enhanced senses were detecting. And then recognition dawned like lightning splitting a dark sky, bringing with it memories of a stubborn black-haired boy who had nearly passed impossible trials through sheer determination alone. Arthur Nightingale, Valen said with something approaching reverence. That remarkable young man who refused to accept defeat even when facing challenges far beyond his capabilities. The royal plane completed its final approach to the palace landing platforms, the city lights now blazingly bright as they prepared to touch down. Camilla gasped as the full weight of the approaching presence finally registered on her consciousness, her enhanced senses struggling to process power levels that shouldn't exist in someone so young. This strength, she whispered in awe. How is such growth possible in just 6 years? I don't know, Valen admitted, his voice carrying genuine wonder at what Arthur had apparently become during his absence. But his return might change everything we thought we knew about the problems facing our continent. The transport settled onto the landing platform with practiced precision, magical stabilizers ensuring smooth arrival despite the tremendous energies swirling through the area. Through the cabin windows, they could see the familiar architecture of their ancestral home, now serving as backdrop to a reunion that could reshape their kingdom's future in ways neither monarch could predict. He's here, Valen said unnecessarily, his voice carrying complex emotions that ranged from genuine pleasure at seeing an old friend to deep apprehension about what this meeting might mean for their carefully guarded secrets. Camilla straightened her formal attire, adopting the regal bearing expected of a queen even as her heart raced with possibility and fear. The boy who impressed you so greatly years ago has returned as something approaching a force of nature, Valen finished, rising from his seat as the transport's doors prepared to open. Whatever Arthur Nightingale has become, our kingdom will never be the same. The reunion was about to begin, and neither ruler could predict whether it would bring salvation or catastrophe to the secrets they had guarded so carefully. Chapter 809, Western Continent, 5. The grand doors of the manor's main hall opened with ceremonial precision, and Valen and Camilla Ashbluff, the king and queen of the Western Continent, entered the room together. Their presence immediately transformed the atmosphere, filling the space with the kind of authority that could only come from decades of ruling one of the world's most powerful nations. Camilla moved with the fluid grace of someone who had mastered both political diplomacy and personal combat. Her auburn hair was arranged in the intricate braids befitting a queen, while her green eyes missed nothing as they swept across the room. I could sense her power immediately, high immortal rank, just slightly below Jean and Callie's current level. Impressive for someone who had never been primarily focused on martial advancement, choosing instead to balance royal duties with personal strength. But it was Valen who truly commanded attention. The king of the Western Continent had always been formidable, but the man who stood before me now had clearly grown even stronger in the years since our last meeting. Mid-radiant rank power radiated from him like controlled sunlight, making the very air around him shimmer with barely contained energy. He had broken through from his previous level, ascending to become not just the strongest ruler in the Western Continent, but the most powerful king in the entire world. The current rank 1. Looking at him now, memories flooded back to that winter break during my second year at Mythos Academy. I had been struggling against the aspect wall, frustrated by my inability to progress beyond the limitations that seemed to define my magical development. Valen had tested me then, pushing me to my absolute limits with trials that had seemed impossibly difficult for someone of my capabilities. Back then, he had represented the absolute pinnacle of what magical achievement could look like. The thought of reaching his level, let alone surpassing it, had seemed like an impossible dream, something so far beyond my potential that even considering it felt like delusion. He had also been the one to later award my guild that generous contract, opening the doors for our operations in the Western continent when other rulers might have been more cautious about allowing foreign magical organizations to establish footholds in their territory. The absolute, perfect necromancer talent. Standing here now, I could feel how dramatically the balance of strength had shifted. Where once Valen's presence had been overwhelming, now I could sense his power clearly without feeling dwarfed by it. The impossible had become reality. I had not only reached his level but transcended it entirely. Arthur Nightingale, Valen said with genuine warmth that couldn't hide his careful assessment of the changes in my capabilities. Welcome back to the Western continent. Your Majesties, I replied with respectful acknowledgement, noting how both rulers were working to process the reality of my enhanced power. Thank you for your hospitality. The pleasure is entirely ours, Camilla said with diplomatic grace that carried undertones of genuine curiosity. Jean and Callie have spoken of you often during your absence. We've been eager to see how you've developed. Her careful choice of words spoke to the political sensitivity of my return. Having someone of my apparent strength appear in their kingdom without warning represented both opportunity and potential threat, depending on my intentions and loyalties. Perhaps we might continue this conversation over dinner? Valen suggested with the kind of casual authority that made his words sound like invitations while functioning as commands. I'm sure you have stories to share about your travels. The dining hall of the Ashbluff Manor was a masterpiece of understated elegance, with enchanted chandeliers casting warm light over a table that could easily accommodate a dozen guests. Tonight, however, it was set for a more intimate gathering. Myself, Stella, Jean, Callie, and the royal couple, creating an atmosphere that balanced formality with family warmth. Stella sat beside me with the kind of perfect posture that spoke to years of careful instruction, her black eyes taking in every detail of the royal dining experience with obvious fascination. She had met nobility before, of course, but never rulers of this magnitude, and her mathematical mind was clearly cataloging the subtle protocols and ceremonial elements that defined royal hospitality. So, Valen said as the first course was served by silent, efficiently moving servants, tell us about your disappearance after the Order's attack on Avalon City. The mention of that catastrophic event brought a momentary silence to the table. The assault on the Slatemark Empire's capital had been one of the most devastating magical attacks in recent history, leaving thousands dead and fundamentally altering the political landscape of the world. The attack itself was more severe than most people realize. I began carefully, aware that my answer would be analyzed for both factual content and political implications. The only reason the damage was limited was because of Lady Alara Astoria and Archduke Leopold Astoria's sacrifice. The reports suggested significant demonic involvement, Camilla said with the kind of precise diplomatic language that invited elaboration without demanding it. A demon duke, I confirmed, noting how Jean and Callie leaned forward slightly at this revelation. The Order had somehow managed to summon a demon duke to Earth. Archduke sacrificed himself to kill the duke, and so did Alara, but to save millions of lives. After which, I made a decision. To get stronger, Valen asked. Exactly, which is why I made the decision to investigate the other end of that connection. I paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle before continuing. I reversed the summoning process and used their own dimensional bridge to travel to a planet ruled by demons. The silence that followed was profound. Even in a world where impossible magical feats occurred regularly, the idea of deliberately traveling to one of the demon realms represented a level of risk that bordered on suicidal insanity. Training against demons, Valen said with growing understanding of how I had achieved such dramatic advancement in seemingly impossible timeframes. 17 demon marquises, I replied, noting how even Valen's impressive composure showed cracks at that number. Each battle pushed me closer to the edge of survival, forcing adaptations and breakthroughs that normal magical development could never achieve. "And now you've returned," Camilla said with careful neutrality that invited explanation of my future intentions. "I have debts to honor," I replied simply. "Promises made years ago that I finally have the power to fulfill." Valen's expression grew thoughtful, his senses no doubt picking up on the subtle but unmistakable determination in my voice. As someone who understood the weight of absolute commitment, he would recognize the kind of resolve that brooked no compromise or delay. "The guild operations you established before your departure have continued to flourish," he said, shifting the conversation toward more immediately practical matters. "Your organization's reputation for handling problems that conventional approaches cannot solve has made them quite valuable to various continental governments." "I'm pleased to hear that," I replied genuinely, "though I suspect the real challenges are just beginning." "The war preparations, you mean?" Camilla asked with the kind of carefully controlled tension that spoke to months of strategic planning and resource allocation. "Among other things," I said, meeting both rulers' eyes with the kind of serious attention that made the air around us grow still. "The cults represent a significant threat, certainly. But sometimes the most dangerous problems are the ones that never make it into public knowledge." The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. Both Valen and Camilla went completely alert, their diplomatic training clearly recognizing that our conversation had just shifted into territory that required extreme caution. "Public knowledge can be limiting when it comes to certain sensitive matters," Valen said with neutral diplomatic language that neither confirmed nor denied anything specific. "Indeed," I agreed, noting how Jean and Callie had also tensed slightly, their enhanced senses picking up on the undercurrents of a conversation that was rapidly approaching topics of critical importance. I took a measured sip of wine, allowing the moment to build before delivering the words that would change everything about this reunion. "I know about Rin," I said quietly, meeting Valen's suddenly sharp gaze with absolute certainty. "I can save her." Chapter 813. Necrotic Sovereign 4. A memory flashed through my mind as I felt my true domain preparing to manifest. The first time I had broken through to low immortal rank while fighting Jack Blazespout in the burning Avalon City. In that moment of triumph and desperation, I had simultaneously unlocked Mythweaver, my third and most complex gift. I had been so overwhelmed by the sheer scope of power that Mythweaver represented, so awed by its reality-altering capabilities, that my domain had been born purely from that single gift. A mistake born of naivety and inexperience, creating a flawed manifestation that relied on only one aspect of my true nature. That mistake would not happen again. "Domain expansion," I said with quiet certainty, feeling the fundamental forces that defined my existence beginning to align in perfect harmony. "Throne of Eternal Twilight." Everything about my development had been rooted in balance from the very beginning. Balance between my swordsmanship and spellcasting. Balance between my pure light and deep dark affinities. Balance between the three fundamental aspects that shaped all magical development. As such, this domain was born from the perfect synthesis of all three gifts, creating something that transcended the limitations of any single power source. Valen's throne of the Eternal Necropolis began to crack and fracture as my domain asserted its dominance over the battlefield. His realm of death and shadow found itself invaded by something that existed in the space between all conventional classifications. Neither pure light nor absolute darkness, but the perfect balance that connected all extremes. The obsidian towers of his necropolis remained, but they were now streaked with veins of pearl and silver that pulsed with gentle radiance. The blood-red sky shifted to the deep purple of eternal twilight, where neither day nor night held dominion. His throne of black bones sprouted crystalline growths that caught and reflected light that shouldn't have existed in a realm of the dead. And at the center of it all, I felt wings unfurling from my back. But these were not the wings of eclipse that I had grown accustomed to manifesting in combat. In my domain, touching the power that had been gifted to me by Goddess Akasha herself, the feathers weren't black with edges of light. They were gray, Pure, perfect gray that represented the ultimate nullification of all opposing forces. The color that existed between all colors, the power that broke every rule this world tried to impose on reality. A crown materialized upon my head, not the golden circlet of divine authority or the obsidian diadem of shadow mastery, but a simple band of the same impossible gray that seemed to absorb and reflect everything simultaneously. Gray, the ultimate power that broke everything in this world. I could only access it within my domain, and even then, my current strength limited how much of that transcendent force I could safely channel. But that limitation didn't matter. In my domain, I was invincible. Valen's eyes widened in genuine shock as he felt the full weight of my transformation pressing against his consciousness. His necropolis, which had seemed so absolute and overwhelming just moments before, now felt like a child's sand castle being gently dismantled by an incoming tide. Impossible, he breathed, his daggers trembling in hands that had never known uncertainty in magical combat. What are you? I didn't answer with words. Instead, I moved. The gray wings carried me forward with speed that transcended normal teleportation, allowing me to simply exist at Valen's location without bothering with the inconvenience of crossing the space between us. My sword came down in a perfect vertical arc, the first movement of my grade 6 art flowing through the blade with devastating precision. Godflash. Valen barely managed to cross his daggers in a defensive position before the strike connected, but the impact sent him crashing through 3 of his own obsidian towers. The structures crumbled to dust around him, their necromantic enchantments unraveling like morning mist before the inexorable advance of gray nullification. He rolled to his feet with the fluid grace of a master warrior, shadow armor flaring to maximum density as he prepared for sustained combat. But I was already there, having crossed the intervening distance through another effortless application of spatial displacement. Godflash, absolute. This time, my blade carved through his defensive formation like it was made of paper, the enhanced version of my technique carrying enough force to split the very air in its wake. Valen's shadow armor held for perhaps a microsecond before dissolving completely, leaving him vulnerable as my follow-up strike sent him tumbling across the fractured ground. You're not even trying, I observed calmly, my voice carrying across the transformed battlefield with casual authority. Is this really the extent of the world's strongest necromancer? Valen snarled, pushing himself upright as dark energy began to coalesce around him in increasingly desperate patterns. 9 circle spell matrices blazed to life beneath his feet, while spectral reinforcements poured from every shadow in his crumbling domain. I responded by channeling my own 9 circle method, a technique I had developed during my training in the demon realm after absorbing Bahamut's dragon heart. The ancient dragon's magical essence had provided the foundation for understanding how to weave multiple complex spell structures simultaneously, creating magical constructs that rivaled the greatest achievements of archmage-level casters. 9 circles of perfect gray energy formed around me, each one pulsing with the kind of balanced power that made Valen's necromantic workings look crude by comparison. The spell I was preparing didn't rely on any single magical school or affinity. Instead, it drew from the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. You want to see improvement? I asked, raising Nixthar as the 9-circle array reached completion. Let me show you what I learned fighting beings that could reshape dimensions. Godflash, singularity. The third and most devastating variation of my grade 6 art's opening movement combined perfectly with the 9-circle spell matrix, creating an attack that existed at the intersection of physical technique and magical supremacy. Nixthar became a conduit for forces that operated beyond conventional understanding, its edgeless blade cutting through concepts as easily as matter. Valen's hastily constructed defenses lasted exactly as long as it took for my strike to reach them. His spell matrices collapsed, his spectral reinforcements were banished to whatever realm they had emerged from, and the man himself was sent flying across his own domain with enough force to crater the ground where he finally came to rest. Blood ran from the corner of his mouth as he struggled to rise, his legendary grade daggers now sporting hairline cracks that spoke to damage that should have been impossible to inflict on weapons of that caliber. This isn't possible, he gasped, his analytical mind clearly struggling to process what was happening to him. I'm mid-radiant rank. I'm the strongest necromancer in the world. How are you? Because rank is just a number, I interrupted, walking toward him with unhurried steps while my gray wings maintained their lazy rhythm. Because you've spent decades perfecting techniques within the system's limitations, while I learned to break those limitations entirely. To demonstrate my point, I shifted to the second movement of my grade 6 art. Hollow Eclipse. The technique manifested as a sphere of absolute void that consumed everything within its radius, not destroying it, but simply removing it from existence on a conceptual level. Part of Valen's domain simply ceased to be, leaving behind empty space that even his necromantic power couldn't fill. You see, I continued conversationally as he stared in horror at the gap in reality I had casually created. Your power operates within the rules. Mine transcends them. Valen's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, growing desperation, and finally, grim determination. If individual power isn't sufficient, he said through gritted teeth, his voice carrying the weight of absolute resolve, then I'll use everything at my disposal. He began channeling massive amounts of mana, his black heart artifact pulsing frantically in his chest, as it fed him the energy reserves necessary for what he was attempting. The process was brutally inefficient. Unsummoning his 3 legendary undead from their separate battles with Luna and Erebus, then immediately resummoning them within his domain. Domain battles separated the combatants from normal spacetime, making it impossible for his summons to simply travel here. Instead, he had to sever their existing manifestations and recreate them entirely, a process that would have drained a normal necromancer's mana reserves completely. But Valen was no ordinary necromancer, and his legendary-grade artifact provided him with vast reservoirs of power to draw upon. Dark energy swirled around him as his 3 greatest creations began to materialize: the massive Bone Dragon, the spectral Dullahan, and the towering Death Lord. His power signature began to shift as he prepared to channel the combined might of all his contracted undead simultaneously. A technique that would either grant him the strength to challenge my dominance or destroy him in the attempt. Interesting, I mused, settling into a comfortable stance while Nixthar hummed with anticipation. Let's see what desperation can accomplish against the impossible. The final phase of our battle was about to begin. Chapter 814. Necrotic Sovereign 5. King Valen Ashbluff, the strongest necromancer in the world and current rank 1 among all rulers, stood amid the twilight ruins of his domain and felt something he had not experienced in over 2 decades of absolute dominance. Fear. Not the tactical concern of facing a dangerous opponent, nor the calculated wariness of political maneuvering. This was primal, existential terror at witnessing power that operated beyond the fundamental laws he had spent his entire life mastering. Arthur Nightingale stood before him, gray wings spread in casual majesty, and Valen's enhanced senses screamed contradictory information that his analytical mind could not reconcile. The young man's mana signature registered as quasi-radiant rank, powerful certainly, but still technically beneath Valen's own mid-radiant rank classification. Yet Arthur wielded 9-circle magic with effortless precision while simultaneously demonstrating sword techniques that showed perfect unity between weapon and wielder. Such capabilities should have been impossible for anyone below full radiant rank, requiring the kind of mana density and control that came only with complete mastery of one's chosen path. How? Valen whispered, the question escaping before he could stop it. You haven't even reached radiant rank. The system readings, the magical signatures, none of this should be possible. Arthur's response was a slight smile that carried no mockery, only patient understanding of forces that transcended conventional classification. The dark energy around Valen intensified as his 3 legendary summons fully materialized within the domain. His Bone Dragon spread wings that blotted out the twilight sky, while the Dullahan's spectral flames burned with renewed intensity. The Death Lord raised its massive greatsword, ancient runes along the blade pulsing with accumulated power from centuries of conquest. Shadow armor flowed across Valen's form like liquid darkness, the defensive technique reaching maximum density as it integrated with his domain's necromantic energy. His twin daggers blazed with perfect dagger unity, the weapons becoming extensions of his will, as he prepared to channel the combined might of everything he had built across decades of relentless advancement. If the natural order has become meaningless, Valen snarled, power crackling around him like controlled lightning, then I'll forge a new reality through absolute force. He attacked with everything he possessed. The bone dragon descended from above, its massive jaws wreathed in soul fire that could incinerate cities. The Dullahan charged from the left, its reality-cutting scythe carving spatial rifts with each swing. The Death Lord advanced from the right, its great sword trailing necromantic energy that withered the very air it passed through. Valen himself struck from the center, his daggers weaving patterns of destruction, while his domain's power amplified every movement. Shadow spikes erupted from the ground in complex formations, spectral armies materialized to provide supporting fire, and the very laws of his necropolis bent to facilitate his assault. It was an attack that could have leveled mountains, shattered armies, and broken the will of any conventional opponent. Arthur moved with fluid precision, his gray wings carrying him through the coordinated assault with minimal wasted motion. Nixthar swept in controlled arcs that deflected rather than destroyed, redirecting the bone dragon's bite away from him while simultaneously batting aside the Dullahan's scythe and parrying the Death Lord's greatsword. His movements were economical, almost gentle. He clearly possessed the power to shatter Valen's legendary summons entirely, but was deliberately holding back to avoid causing permanent damage. "I don't want to hurt you unnecessarily," Arthur said as he caught Valen's crossed daggers on Nixthar's edge, the weapons trembling under the strain of opposing forces. "But you need to understand the difference in our capabilities." With a subtle twist of his wrist, Arthur sent Valen flying backward, the king's shadow armor absorbing most of the impact but failing to prevent him from crashing through one of his own obsidian towers. "Your technique is flawless," Arthur continued, advancing at a measured pace while Valen's summons regrouped around their master. "Your mastery over necromancy is genuinely impressive, but you're still operating within the system's limitations." To demonstrate, he raised Nixthar and executed his third movement with reduced intensity. Stellar Cascade. The controlled waterfall of cutting energy swept across the battlefield, but instead of erasing Valen's summons, it severed their connection to his mana. The bone dragon crashed to the ground as its animating force was disrupted, while the Dullahan and Death Lord froze in place as their spectral flames guttered out. Not destroyed, simply powered down like complex machines that had been temporarily disconnected from their energy source. Valen staggered to his feet, his mind reeling from the precise way Arthur had neutralized legendary constructs without actually damaging them. The technical skill required for such controlled application of overwhelming force spoke to understanding that went far beyond raw power. His domain began to pulse with renewed energy as he prepared his ultimate technique, drawing power from every corner of his realm, while his artifact pushed beyond safe operational limits. The obsidian towers blazed with necromantic fire, while the throne of black bone behind him cracked and reformed into something larger and more terrible. Domain expansion. True throne of the eternal necropolis. Reality itself bent as Valen's enhanced domain asserted its dominance over the battlefield. This was beyond his normal manifestation. This was the technique he had reserved for threats to the Western continent itself, the power that could reshape the laws of life and death across entire kingdoms. The twilight that had invaded his realm was pushed back by waves of absolute darkness, while spectral armies numbering in the millions materialized from the spaces between heartbeats. The very concept of death became weaponized, turning the air itself into something that could drain life from any living being foolish enough to oppose the Necropolis King's will. For a moment, just a moment, Valen felt the familiar rush of absolute power that had defined his reign. This was the strength that had made him the world's strongest ruler, the force that could stand against continental threats and emerge victorious. Arthur looked at the enhanced domain, at the millions of spectral warriors, at the reality-warping necromantic energy that filled every cubic inch of space around them. And he laughed. The sound wasn't mocking or cruel. It carried genuine amusement, as though he had just witnessed something delightfully entertaining. In response to that laughter, Nixthar began to blaze with light that transcended conventional description. Not the golden radiance of divine power or the silver gleam of purified mana. This was the impossible luminosity of gray made manifest, the edgeless blade becoming a conduit for forces that operated beyond the boundaries of what reality considered possible. "You still don't understand," Arthur said, raising the blazing sword above his head in a grip that promised absolute finality. "Let me show you what lies beyond the system's limitations." He swung. Valen's enhanced domain, his ultimate technique, his life's masterwork, the power that could rival continental threats. Split in half. Not destroyed through overwhelming force. Not countered through superior technique. Simply divided along a line of perfect separation that ran from the zenith of his necropolis to its deepest foundations, as though reality itself had been convinced that two distinct spaces could exist in the same location. The spectral armies on one side of the line continued their eternal march, while those on the other simply weren't. The obsidian towers split perfectly down their centers, their upper halves existing in one reality while their foundations remained in another. Even the throne of black bone found itself divided, half of it supporting empty air while the other half waited for a king who could no longer reach it. But it was what Valen saw beyond his shattered domain that truly shattered his mind. The sky itself bore a line of separation that stretched from horizon to horizon, a perfect cut through the heavens that revealed the deeper truths lying beneath reality's surface. It was identical to the legendary feat recorded in history books, the moment when the martial king had split the sky itself upon reaching the level of demigod, demonstrating power that transcended mortal understanding. "No," Valen whispered, his legs giving out as the full implications crashed over him like a tide of inevitability. That's the mark of Arthur Nightingale, still technically classified as quasi-radiant rank according to every measurement system in existence, lowered his sword and looked at the split sky with casual satisfaction. "Now you understand," he said quietly. Consciousness fled from Valen's mind like water from a shattered vessel, his body collapsing amid the ruins of everything he had believed about power and possibility. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was that impossible line bisecting the heavens. Proof that the young man standing over him had achieved something that should have been beyond the reach of anyone in this generation. The battle was over. Arthur had won without even reaching his true peak. Chapter 8:15. Rin Ashbluff 1. What my master had shown me before his death was a strike that could cut open the sky itself. The memory flickered through my mind as I watched Valen's enhanced domain split along that perfect line, the heavens themselves bearing witness to power that transcended mortal understanding. My mastery of the sword wasn't high enough to replicate that legendary technique through pure skill alone. Not yet. However, I could achieve the same devastating result by channeling Gray through Nixthar, using the impossible power that existed between all extremes. That was the basis of the fifth movement of my Grade 6 art, a technique I had been developing since my return from the demon realm. It was a movement I could only use within my domain, where the gray power flowed freely, and one that would need significant refinement before I could execute it properly after achieving true radiant rank. The technique was incomplete, dangerous to attempt, and cost more energy than I could safely sustain for extended periods. However, it was more than enough to defeat Valen Ashbluff. The king of the western continent collapsed as consciousness fled from his overwhelmed mind, his shadow armor dissolving like morning mist, while his legendary summons faded back into whatever realm they called home. The split sky overhead began to slowly heal itself, reality reasserting its natural order now that the gray power was no longer actively maintaining the impossible division. I felt exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Using gray, even within my domain, placed tremendous strain on my soul and mind. The power wasn't meant for beings at my current level. It was a force that belonged to entities who had transcended the normal boundaries of existence entirely. But as I stood over Valen's unconscious form, I felt something else that made all the effort worthwhile. The breaking of a spell. My enhanced senses, still heightened by soul vision and Seraphim's embrace, detected the unraveling of massive magical constructs somewhere deep within the Ashbluff Royal Palace. 9 circle enchantments that had been maintained for years were suddenly coming apart, their carefully woven matrices dissolving as their primary anchor. Valen's conscious will lost coherence. I whipped my head toward the eastern wing of the palace, where the strongest concentration of failing magic originated. Through the walls and magical barriers, I could feel something stirring, something that had been sleeping for far too long. Rin. My gray wings dissolved as my domain collapsed, the tremendous energy expenditure finally catching up to me as the crown of impossible light faded from my head. The Twilight Realm gave way to normal reality, leaving us standing in the somewhat battered training grounds while the evening sky slowly returned to its natural color. "She's free now," I said, though whether I was speaking to the unconscious Valen or simply voicing my realization aloud, I wasn't entirely sure. Before I could process the full implications of what was happening, an overwhelming pressure descended upon the palace grounds like a physical weight. The air itself became thick and oppressive, charged with magical energy that made my enhanced senses scream warnings of imminent danger. Luna materialized beside me, her usual teenage appearance tense with concern. "Arthur, something's wrong. That power signature." "I know." I cut her off, already moving toward the palace as the pressure continued to build. "Valen's containment spells are failing completely. We need to reach her before." The intricate 9-circle spell binding Rin Ashbluff finally unraveled completely, its luminous fragments scattering like fireflies in the wind. The magical backlash from such a massive enchantment collapsing sent ripples through the local mana field that would be detectable from miles away. I didn't waste time with conventional movement. Channeling what remained of my enhanced capabilities, I launched myself toward the eastern wing of the palace, covering the distance in a series of space-warping leaps that brought me to the sealed chambers in seconds. The door, reinforced with layers of protective enchantments that should have required specialized tools to breach, hung open like a mouth screaming into darkness. The magical locks had simply ceased to function when their primary binding collapsed, leaving nothing but ordinary wood and metal to guard against what lay within. I stepped through the doorway and felt my breath catch in my throat. The room was elegant despite its obvious purpose as a prison, with fine furniture and amenities that spoke to Valen and Camilla's love for their daughter even as they had been forced to contain her. Bookshelves lined the walls, while enchanted windows provided the illusion of outside views to make the confinement more bearable. And on the bed, sitting with perfect posture that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any aggressive stance, was a woman. Rin Ashbluff appeared to be in her early 20s, with pure black hair that fell in elegant waves around a face of porcelain perfection. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed to swallow light, while her expression betrayed no emotion whatsoever. She could have been a beautiful doll crafted by master artisans, save for one crucial detail. The aura surrounding her was unmistakably that of peak immortal rank. But it wasn't just the magnitude of her strength that set every instinct I possessed on high alert. There was something fundamentally wrong with the energy she projected, a wrongness that went beyond simple corruption into territory that felt actively hostile to the natural order. Dark mana and miasma poured from her in waves that made the very air tremble, the sheer weight of her presence sending involuntary shivers down my spine despite everything I had experienced. This wasn't the controlled power of a trained mage or even the raw fury of a magical beast. This was something that existed in opposition to life itself. "Rin," I said quietly, keeping my voice low and non-threatening as I stepped closer to the bed. Her head turned toward me with mechanical precision, those dark eyes focusing on my face with an intensity that felt like being examined by something that viewed humans as curious specimens rather than fellow thinking beings. "Human," she replied, her voice carrying the same emotional detachment as her expression. The word came out flat and analytical, as though she were categorizing me according to criteria I couldn't understand. Her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that might have been curiosity if there had been any warmth in her demeanor. "Spell no more. Kill I can kill." The casual way she discussed taking life made my blood run cold. This wasn't malicious threat or angry posturing. She was simply stating a fact about her capabilities with the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. The dark energies swirling around her intensified as she spoke, and I felt the very real possibility that she might decide to test her stated capabilities on the nearest available target. My reflexes tensed, preparing for combat even as my rational mind insisted that fighting her would be suicide in my current condition. "Jean, Luna," I called out, projecting my voice with enough force to carry throughout the palace. Jean appeared almost instantly, materializing from shadows with the kind of speed that spoke to genuine alarm at the magical disturbance we were all feeling. Dark mana coalesced around his hands as he assessed the situation, his training immediately recognizing the threat level represented by his sister's transformed state. Chains of concentrated shadow erupted from the floor, wrapping around Rin's limbs with the kind of binding force that could restrain most magical beings. The technique was perfectly executed, showing Jin's mastery over his family's traditional magic while demonstrating his understanding of what needed to be done. Rin didn't flinch at the sudden restraint. She simply looked down at the chains with that same tilted head gesture, studying them as though they were mildly interesting decorations rather than magical bindings designed to contain her power. With a subtle flex of her arms, the kind of casual movement someone might make when stretching after a long nap, the shadow chains groaned under tremendous strain. I could see the magical constructs beginning to fracture as they encountered force far beyond their design parameters. Before the bindings could snap completely, Luna stepped forward with the calm confidence that came from millennia of experience dealing with dangerous magical entities. "Sleep," she whispered, placing one delicate hand on Rin's head while her mana flared with controlled precision. The technique Luna employed was deceptively simple in appearance but incredibly sophisticated in execution. Rather than trying to overwhelm Rin's tremendous power through brute force, she targeted the specific neural pathways responsible for consciousness, using surgical precision to induce slumber without triggering defensive responses. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Rin's dark eyes fluttered shut. Her body went limp as the forced sleep took hold, the overwhelming pressure of her aura diminishing to more manageable levels as her conscious control over her power relaxed. Jin's shadow chains dissolved as the immediate threat passed, though he remained tense and ready to act if the situation changed. "Her mental strength is surprisingly weak," Luna observed with obvious relief, her voice carrying notes of professional assessment. "Despite her tremendous magical power, her psychological defenses are almost non-existent. It's as though all her development focused on raw capability while ignoring protective mechanisms." She turned to me, her ancient eyes serious despite her youthful appearance. "The corruption has been growing unchecked for years, creating patterns that are fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness. Her mind is fragmenting under the strain. Can it be fixed?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what needed to be done. "Not from the outside," Luna confirmed with a shake of her head. "The damage is too deep, too integrated with her core identity. Someone would need to enter her mindscape directly and address the corruption at its source." "The risks," I continued, knowing there had to be significant dangers involved in such a technique. "Considerable," Luna admitted. "Mental contact with someone this unstable could result in your own consciousness being overwhelmed or corrupted. If her subconscious mind perceives you as a threat, she could trap you indefinitely within her internal landscape." I looked down at Rin's peaceful sleeping face, noting how the absence of that unsettling awareness made her appear almost normal again. Almost like the child I remembered from years ago, before the corruption had begun its terrible work. "Are you ready?" Luna asked quietly, her mana beginning to shimmer with the complex preparations necessary for consciousness transfer. I nodded, settling into a comfortable position beside Rin's bed, while Luna's power enveloped both of us in a soft, protective cocoon. The world around me dissolved into streams of light and shadow as my consciousness detached from my physical form. And with that, I descended into Rin's mind. Chapter 8:16. Rin Ashbluff. 2. The world dissolved around me as I descended into Rin's mindscape, consciousness fragmenting into streams of memory and emotion that pulled me through years of carefully buried trauma. Luna's technique had worked perfectly, allowing my awareness to slip past the defensive barriers that surrounded Rin's psyche and into the deepest chambers where her true self remained hidden. The first memory that surfaced came with crystalline clarity, as though I were experiencing it firsthand rather than observing from a distance. September 9th, 2027. The sterile corridors of the Ashbluff Estate's medical wing echoed with the sound of a woman's cries, each scream cutting through the air like a blade drawn across glass. I found myself standing beside Valen Ashbluff, not the king I had just fought, but a younger version whose stoic expression couldn't quite mask the anxiety radiating from his every movement. His fingers drummed against the hilt of his dagger in an unconscious rhythm that spoke to nerves stretched beyond their breaking point. The man who commanded armies and ruled a continent was utterly helpless in the face of his wife's suffering, reduced to pacing outside a delivery room while medical professionals handled something far beyond his ability to control. We should have used artificial wombs. His thoughts echoed in the memory space around me. Enhanced genetics, perfect development conditions. No risk to Camila, but then the children wouldn't be able to channel mana properly. The Ashbluff bloodline demands natural birth, even if it means. Camila's screams intensified, and I felt Valen's composure crack slightly as genuine fear bled through his royal training. The prospect of losing either his wife or children in childbirth was something no amount of political maneuvering or military strategy could address. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the cries faded into silence that felt heavier than any sound. The delivery room doors opened with a soft hiss, and a doctor emerged with the kind of carefully controlled expression that spoke to good news delivered with professional restraint. "Your Majesty," the physician said with practiced reverence. "Her Majesty has delivered safely. Please, come inside." I followed Valen's memory into the pristine medical chamber, where Camila lay exhausted but radiant on the specialized bed. In her arms, she cradled 2 bundles of silk-wrapped life, her face glowing with the kind of tired joy that only new mothers could truly understand. "Twins?" Valen breathed, his voice carrying wonder that made him sound almost boyish despite his imposing presence. "A son and a daughter," Camila confirmed, her eyes shining as she looked up at her husband. "Perfect and healthy. Both of them." The memory shifted as I watched Valen approach the bed with uncharacteristic hesitancy, his powerful hands trembling slightly as he reached for the infant Camila offered him. The sight of the Western continent's most feared ruler reduced to nervous uncertainty by something as simple as holding his newborn daughter created a stark contrast that humanized him in ways his public persona never allowed. "What shall we name them?" Camila asked softly, her voice carrying the kind of gentle exhaustion that spoke to hours of labor finally concluded. Valen gazed down at the 2 children, their identical black hair and dark eyes marking them unmistakably as his offspring. For a moment, his stoic mask completely dissolved, replaced by paternal love so pure it made the surrounding memory glow with warmth. "Rin and Jean," he said with quiet certainty. "Perfect," Camila agreed, her smile widening with approval. The scene dissolved and reformed, showing me glimpses of the twins' early years. I watched Jean and Rin grow from infants into children, their personalities developing in ways that reflected their parents' influence while maintaining distinct individual characteristics. Jean showed early signs of the analytical thinking and diplomatic grace that would serve him well as heir to the throne, while Rin demonstrated a curious intelligence tempered by genuine kindness toward everyone around her. Both children were clearly loved beyond measure, raised in an environment where their parents' affection provided foundation for healthy development, despite the enormous pressures that came with royal birth. Then the memory shifted to their 5th birthday, and I felt the emotional atmosphere darken with approaching tragedy. The gift awakening ceremony was a sacred tradition in the Ashbluff family, marking the moment when latent magical abilities first manifested in their bloodline. I watched as the family gathered in a specially prepared chamber, its walls inscribed with generations of protective enchantments designed to contain any unexpected magical manifestations. Jean went first, stepping forward with the kind of quiet confidence that would define his approach to challenges throughout his life. The ceremonial appraiser, an elderly mage whose expertise in magical assessment was renowned throughout the continent, began the ritual with practiced precision. Mana swirled around the boy in patterns that spoke to powerful potential awakening within his young form. When the energy finally settled, the appraiser's face lit up with genuine excitement. "You have been blessed with the gift of Necromancer's touch," he announced with obvious pleasure. The pride that radiated from Valen was almost tangible, his satisfaction at seeing his family's traditional magic manifest in his son clear in every aspect of his posture. He placed a firm hand on Jin's head, the gesture carrying approval and promise of future training to develop this remarkable ability. Then it was Rin's turn. I felt the memory's emotional tenor shift as the 5-year-old girl stepped forward with the same quiet confidence her brother had shown. But something was different about the way Mana responded to her presence. The energy in the room grew darker, heavier, as though something fundamentally wrong was about to occur. Rin's black hair began to shimmer with an oily iridescence that spoke to forces no child should have been able to access. The appraiser leaned forward with professional interest that rapidly transformed into growing alarm as his enhanced senses detected energies that violated every natural law he understood. And then blood exploded across the chamber. The appraiser screamed as massive wounds opened across his chest, the injuries appearing instantaneously as though carved by invisible blades. He stumbled backward, clutching at torn flesh while his professional composure shattered under the reality of what was happening. Valen reacted with the speed of someone whose survival had depended on split-second decisions for decades. His mana twisted through the room's ambient energy, creating binding constructs that froze Rin in place before she could cause additional damage. "Rin," he said carefully, his voice carrying the kind of cautious authority used to address dangerous wild animals. The child who turned toward him was not the daughter he had raised with such care and love. Rin's dark eyes had become windows into something alien and hostile, while her innocent features twisted into an expression of pure malevolence. "Kill," she hissed, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "Kill, kill, kill." The words emerged as a chant of absolute commitment to destruction, each repetition driving home the terrible truth of what the Gift Awakening had revealed. This was not magical corruption or temporary possession. This was Rin's fundamental nature asserting itself for the first time. "Sleep," Valen whispered desperately, pouring his will into the command with enough force to render unconscious most beings short of radiant rank. Rin's body went limp as enforced slumber claimed her, the murderous intelligence fading from her eyes as her consciousness retreated. The king turned toward the wounded appraiser with an expression that promised consequences beyond imagination if the wrong words were spoken. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had ended wars through diplomatic pressure alone. The elderly mage dropped to his knees despite his injuries, terror overriding professional dignity as he processed the implications of what he had witnessed. "Your Majesty," he stammered, blood still seeping through his fingers. "Your daughter, she possesses a miasmic gift." The silence that followed was profound enough to feel like physical pressure against everyone present. Miasma, the antithesis of human magical development, the force that drove corrupted creatures to seek the destruction of all civilization. For such power to manifest in a member of the royal family represented catastrophe on a scale that threatened the stability of the entire continent. "None of you will speak of this beyond these walls," Valen said with deadly quiet that made the air itself seem to vibrate with suppressed violence. "From this moment forward, Princess Rin Ashbluff is officially dead. Anyone who suggests otherwise will discover that some fates are worse than simple execution." The memory shifted again, showing me years of desperate research and increasingly futile attempts at finding solutions. I watched Valen and Camilla work through nights that blended into days, consulting ancient texts and forbidden grimoires, while seeking aid from sources they would never have approached under normal circumstances. As the years passed, I watched Valen's strength diminish under the constant strain of maintaining the seals that contained his daughter's growing power. The man who had once stood as the continent's strongest ruler was slowly killing himself to prevent a catastrophe that seemed increasingly inevitable. "We can't save her," Camilla whispered during one particularly dark moment, her voice breaking with accumulated despair. "Not like this. Not with anything we've tried." "She'll surpass me soon," Valen replied hollowly, staring at the sealed door that had become his daughter's entire world. "And when she does, everything we've built will fall. Everyone we're sworn to protect will die." The memories faded, leaving me standing in a space that felt like the intersection between dream and reality. The chaotic swirl of Rin's traumatic experiences settled into something resembling a physical location. A simple room with walls that flickered between the elegant chambers of her childhood and the sterile prison of her teenage years. And there, sitting on a bed that existed in both timelines simultaneously, was Rin herself. But this wasn't the corrupted being I had encountered in the physical world. This was the core consciousness that had been buried beneath years of miasmic influence, a fragment of what she might have been if fate had been kinder. Her black hair flowed freely around shoulders that carried none of the unnatural tension I had observed earlier. Her dark eyes, unclouded by destructive impulses, held a clarity that spoke to intelligence unmarred by forced malevolence. She appeared almost serene, but the words that emerged from her lips carried weight that made the surrounding mindscape tremble. "You saw it all, didn't you?" she said, her voice melodious but edged with resignation that cut deeper than any blade. "How I'm going to kill my own family. How everything my parents sacrificed means nothing because I'm fundamentally broken." I studied her carefully, noting the subtle differences between this manifestation and the memories I had just experienced. This was Rin as she truly was beneath the corruption. Still herself, still capable of love and rational thought, but carrying the full weight of understanding about what she represented to everyone around her. "Just kill me," she continued with a shallow smile that couldn't hide the pain behind her request. "Me being alive is the worst crime possible. Every day I continue to exist brings my family closer to destruction." "Sorry, but no," I replied with a casual shrug that treated her desperate plea as nothing more significant than a request for the time. Her expression darkened, confusion and frustration bleeding through the resigned facade she had been maintaining. "I won't thank you for saving me," she said with growing intensity. "I just want to die so I won't be a burden to my family anymore. I don't feel anything except the urge to destroy. I can't exist as anything except a weapon pointed at the people I love most. Don't save me. Don't care about me. Just kill me and let this nightmare end." I met her gaze without flinching, recognizing the genuine anguish behind her words while refusing to accept the conclusion she had reached. "You love them, don't you?" I asked simply. The question hit her like a physical blow, her carefully constructed emotional barriers cracking under the weight of absolute truth. "I do," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "How could I not love my own family? They're everything to me." "Then you want to give up on them?" I pressed, allowing steel to enter my voice. "After your father sealed you for 17 years, desperately searching for any way to save you? After your mother cried herself to sleep every night, knowing her daughter was suffering but unable to help? You want to throw all of that sacrifice away because the solution seems impossible?" Rin's composure cracked further, tears beginning to gather in eyes that had carried nothing but resignation moments before. "No, you don't understand," she protested desperately. "I am the problem. As long as I exist. I know exactly who you are," I interrupted with firm conviction that cut through her spiral of self-recrimination. "And I don't care about the corruption or the destructive impulses or any of the other problems everyone else sees as insurmountable." "Then you're a fool," she whispered, but the words carried hope rather than condemnation. "Maybe," I agreed with a slight smile, "but I'm a fool who knows how to fix the impossible." Without waiting for her response, I stepped forward into the heart of her mindscape, my resolve unwavering despite the challenges that lay ahead. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 817, Rin Ashbluff, 3. I stepped through the threshold of Rin's consciousness, her spectral figure watching with hollow resignation as I passed beyond the barrier that separated her surface thoughts from the deeper truths buried within. The moment I crossed that invisible line, reality began to fracture around me like glass struck by lightning. The world twisted violently, shapes bending in ways that defied geometric logic while light and shadow flickered in chaotic patterns that hurt to observe directly. My enhanced senses, still active even in this mental realm, struggled to process the impossible geometries surrounding me as Rin's traumatic memories bled through the fabric of her psyche. Then, with jarring suddenness, solid ground materialized beneath my feet, and with it came the stench of war. "Move!" The aerial divisions are being torn apart. A commanding voice bellowed across what had become a battlefield of unprecedented scale. I looked up to see the sky alive with desperate combat. Sleek aircraft and massive aerial carriers engaged in futile battle against tendrils of pure black mana that erupted from the earth like malevolent lightning. Each explosion painted the heavens in streaks of orange and crimson, while the twisted remains of once proud war machines crashed to the ground with thunderous impacts that made the earth tremble beneath my feet. My steps were hesitant but determined as I pushed forward through the chaos, my instincts screaming warnings, while my rational mind worked to process the scope of what I was witnessing. This wasn't just a battle between armies. This was annihilation on a scale that transcended conventional warfare. The ground beneath my feet was saturated with blood, dark and sticky, pooling around the corpses of soldiers whose faces remained frozen in expressions of terror and agony. Shattered weapons and torn banners littered the battlefield like the debris of civilization itself, while the air reeked of ozone, burning metal, and the iron tang of mass death. As I continued forward, understanding crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. In the novel of this world, certain individuals earned classification as calamities, beings whose very existence spelled doom for entire civilizations. The first calamity, the heavenly demon, ended the golden age of humanity. The second calamity, Caladros the vampire monarch, had consumed the eastern continent in a tide of crimson night. The third calamity, Jack Blazespout the Hellflame Emperor, had reduced the southern continent to smoldering wasteland. And now, standing at the epicenter of this apocalyptic vision, was the being who would become known as the fourth calamity. Rin Ashbluff. This wasn't memory or fantasy. This was prophecy, a glimpse of the future that would unfold if the seals containing her corruption ever failed completely. The western continent wouldn't simply fall to her power. It would be erased from existence, swept away like sand before a tsunami of pure destructive force. Not on my watch, I muttered under my breath, clenching my fists as I pressed deeper into the heart of the vision. Near the center of the devastation, I could see military commanders desperately trying to coordinate a response that had already failed before it began. "When will reinforcements arrive?" demanded a general whose voice trembled despite the gleaming dark armor that marked him as a low immortal rank Dark Knight. His question hung unanswered in air thick with despair, because there was no reinforcement capable of addressing what they faced. I wove through the chaos of the battlefield, stepping over the bodies of soldiers who had died believing they were defending their homeland against a threat they could understand. My eyes remained fixed on the epicenter of destruction, where the source of all this devastation waited. Rin stood at the heart of the storm, her presence both magnificent and terrifying in its absolute wrongness. A semi-transparent barrier shimmered around her. Not a true domain, but a construct of pure malevolent intent that served as both shield and weapon. It repelled approaching soldiers like leaves caught in a hurricane, sending grown warriors tumbling backward with their will to fight shattered before they could even reach striking distance. Unlike a proper domain, this barrier didn't imprison its victims. It simply annihilated their capacity for resistance, turning brave soldiers into broken survivors who could only flee in terror. "She's absurdly powerful," I thought with growing unease, my enhanced senses cataloging capabilities that defied easy classification. This wasn't the frail girl who had been sealed away for 17 years. This was Rin transformed into the fourth calamity, her mana core burning with the intensity of low radiant rank, while her combat instincts showed refinement that surpassed even Valen's decades of experience. I pressed forward through the thinning chaos, the devastation around me becoming more absolute as I approached her position. A soldier reached out desperately to stop me, fear etched across his blood-streaked face. "Wait, what are you doing?" he yelled, his hand grasping at my sleeve. "That's certain death." I brushed past his grip without breaking stride, my focus entirely on the shimmering barrier that loomed ahead. The moment my body made contact with its edge, something extraordinary happened. Parted for me like water before a blade. I stepped inside the zone of absolute destruction, feeling the oppressive weight of corrupted power pressing against my consciousness from all directions. At the center of this maelstrom of black mana stood Rin herself, her dark eyes turning toward me with interest that carried no trace of humanity. "Oh!" Her voice was soft but laced with malice that made the air itself seem to recoil. "Someone strong has come to die. How delightful. I'll kill you slowly." Black mana surged around her in waves that made reality itself seem to bend and warp, each pulse carrying enough destructive force to level city blocks. I felt a chill run down my spine despite my determination to see this through. "Apologies," I said, steadying myself as I began to channel my own power. "But I won't be killing you, or dying here for that matter." Her corrupted mana crackled with anticipation of violence, coiling and uncoiling like a serpent preparing to strike. In response, I called upon everything I had learned during my time in the demon realm. Soul resonance flooded my system, granting me mythic body enhancement, while soul vision allowed me to perceive the true flow of her attacks. Lucent harmony synchronized my magical channels for optimal efficiency, while Seraphim's embrace wrapped me in protective energy that made my skin shine with subtle divine radiance. Then I opened my domain. Domain expansion. Throne of Eternal Twilight. The Twilight Realm burst forth around me, transforming the apocalyptic battlefield into something balanced between light and shadow, order and chaos. Unlike Rin's barrier of pure destruction, my domain radiated controlled authority, the perfect synthesis of all three aspects of magical development working in absolute harmony. Gray wings unfurled from my back, their impossible coloration speaking to power that existed between all conventional classifications. A crown of the same perfect gray materialized upon my head, neither light nor dark but the balance point that connected all extremes. This time, I chose to keep my domain's boundaries permeable. The armies beyond could witness everything that occurred within, seeing clearly how this confrontation would unfold without risking interference from desperate commanders who might try to bombard the area with artillery or magical attacks. "At least she doesn't have a proper legendary-grade artifact for direct combat," I noted, observing the black heart embedded in her chest. Valen's artifact was powerful, certainly, but it was designed for large-scale necromantic manipulation rather than personal dueling. Against me, its effectiveness would be significantly reduced. Light cascaded around me as my domain reached full manifestation, the gray power flowing through my being like liquid starlight. I was using everything, every technique learned through desperate battles, every enhancement earned through impossible trials, every gift that had been granted or stolen or earned through blood and sacrifice. Mythweaver pulsed in the depths of my consciousness, ready to reshape reality according to my will. Soul resonance provided perfect awareness of every threat and opportunity. Lucent harmony balanced the chaos of combat with the serenity of absolute purpose. In my hand, Nixthar gleamed with anticipation, its edgeless blade singing with power as my perfected techniques guided every movement. This weapon had tasted the blood of marquee-level demons and carved through the fundamental forces of reality itself. I wouldn't lose here. I couldn't afford to lose, because this wasn't about proving my strength or testing my capabilities. This was about her, about Rin Ashbluff, the girl who had been buried beneath layers of corruption and despair, waiting for someone to remember that she was worth saving. The battle for her soul was about to begin. Chapter 818. Rin Ashbluff. 4. Kill. The word pulsed through Rin's corrupted consciousness like a heartbeat made of pure malevolence, echoing through every fiber of her being with relentless, consuming intensity. It wasn't a thought, it was existence itself, as fundamental as breathing and infinitely more urgent. Her dark eyes swept across the battlefield, categorizing everything she saw not as individuals or obstacles, but as targets requiring elimination. She had to kill them all, every last human. The compulsion was absolute. Her smile was a work of art crafted from nightmares, devoid of any trace of humanity, while miasma and dark mana crackled around her like twin hurricanes vying for supremacy. The miasma, true anathema to human magical development, coiled with hunger that transcended mortal understanding, while dark mana danced alongside it in perfect synchronization, amplifying her already overwhelming capabilities. Together, they fed into the terrifying power of duality, her gift. Rin didn't need the meticulous training that defined conventional mages or the careful spell construction that limited normal practitioners. Her magic wasn't learned through study or practice. It was born from instinct, raw and immediate, the kind of power that made mockery of academic limitations. A spell began forming without conscious direction, manifesting as a monstrous arrow of purple energy that vibrated with the destructive potential of nine-circle magic. It radiated pure malice, making the very air tremble under the pressure of its creation while reality bent slightly around its edges. Without hesitation, Rin released the attack, watching with predatory satisfaction as the arrow of carnage tore through space toward Arthur. Arthur's response was a single, perfectly controlled movement. Nixthar swept in a precise arc, and the devastating spell simply ceased to exist. Not deflected or absorbed, unraveled at the conceptual level, its carefully woven structure dissolving into harmless energy that dissipated like morning mist. "Kill," Rin muttered, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. The word itself seemed to reshape reality around her, making the corrupted ground beneath her feet crack and split in response to her will. But before she could launch another attack, something impossible happened. Arthur's hand rested gently on her shoulder. Impossible. She was faster than this, stronger than this. Her enhanced perception should have tracked his movement. Her reflexes should have intercepted any approach. Yet somehow he had simply appeared beside her, his touch carrying warmth that made the miasma recoil instinctively. Rin spun around with inhuman speed, her fist lashing out with enough force to shatter mountains. The strike was wreathed in astral energy forged from the twisted fusion of her dual nature, carrying power that could crack continental shelves. Arthur sidestepped the devastating blow with fluid grace, his hands sliding from her shoulder to her back in a gesture that somehow managed to be comforting despite the circumstances. The gray wings that sprouted from his shoulders moved with lazy confidence, their impossible coloration speaking to authorities that transcended normal magical classification. Rin's eyes narrowed as new spells began forming around her, droplets of absolute darkness that materialized in the air like fragments of the void given physical form. Each point of light-consuming shadow carried enough destructive potential to level cities, while their combined effect promised annihilation on a scale that defied comprehension. Arthur looked at the approaching devastation and simply smiled. The expression wasn't mocking or dismissive. It carried genuine warmth, as though he were watching a child struggle with a difficult but ultimately harmless task. That smile made Rin's corruption rage with fury, while something deeper within her consciousness stirred with emotions she had thought permanently buried. She spread the spell wide, letting it blanket the entire battlefield in a tidal wave of absolute destruction. This wasn't merely an attack, it was the weaponization of entropy itself, designed to unmake everything it touched on a fundamental level. Arthur raised Nixthar, and the blade's tip touched the ground with surgical precision. Fourth movement of his Grade 6 art, Pond of Tranquility. In an instant, every droplet of darkness was neutralized. The space around Arthur became perfect stillness, a sphere of absolute negation that dominated the immediate area while reality reasserted natural order within its boundaries. Rin's ultimate attack simply stopped existing, its carefully constructed malevolence unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry. "Let it all out," Arthur said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of unshakable confidence that came from facing impossible odds and emerging victorious. Space warped around him as he closed the distance between them in a single step, his hand returning to her head with gentle persistence. "I can take it. Kill!" Rin snarled through gritted teeth, miasma surging as she lashed out with another devastating punch. But Arthur warped space again, his movement so fluid and absolute that her fist met nothing but empty air. She twisted her own considerable power, her capabilities as a radiant rank mage allowing her to bend spatial dimensions according to her will. Yet no matter how she tried, she couldn't detect the subtle shifts when Arthur moved. It wasn't that he was faster, it was that he operated according to different rules entirely. His throne of eternal twilight dominated the very fabric of reality within its boundaries, creating a space where his authority was absolute. Rin's immense power, corrupted though it was, couldn't overcome the sheer inevitability of his domain's influence. The battle continued as a dance of chaos and restraint. Arthur never raised his sword to harm her, never responded to her fury with matching violence. Instead, he embraced her with actions that defied the very nature of their surroundings. A gentle touch here, a patient presence there, an unshakable calm that refused to yield under her desperation. Rin poured everything she possessed into her attacks. Miasma fused with conventional energy to create spells of pure annihilation. Her fists struck with enough force to reshape landscapes. Raw, unbridled power flowed from her in waves that should have overwhelmed any opposition. Yet despite her might, an absolute gap existed between them. Not born of strength alone, but of purpose and will refined through trials that had forged Arthur into something beyond conventional classification. 9 circles of gray energy materialized around Arthur as he prepared to demonstrate the technique he had developed during his time in the demon realm. The magical method he had created after absorbing Bahamut's dragon heart allowed him to weave multiple complex spell structures simultaneously, creating constructs that rivaled the greatest achievements of Archmage-level practitioners. But instead of using this overwhelming power to destroy, he channeled it into containment and redirection, turning Rin's own attacks against themselves while never allowing permanent harm to reach her. Why? Rin's voice cracked as her rational mind began to peek through the layers of corruption, exhaustion making it harder for the miasma to maintain absolute control. Why don't you just kill me? It would be so much easier. I want to save you, Arthur replied with simple honesty that cut through her despair like a blade of pure light. Why? Are you some kind of hero? She spat, derision failing to mask the tremor of desperate hope beneath her words. Arthur tilted his head slightly, his expression softening while his gray-crowned authority never wavered. A hero sacrifices one person for the world, he said with quiet conviction. I'm just a crazy bastard who'd sacrifice the world for one person. Rin froze, her mind struggling to process words that redefined everything she thought she understood about strength and purpose. What? She whispered, vulnerability bleeding through her corrupted facade. Before she could react further, Arthur moved, not aggressively, but with the kind of deliberate care reserved for the most precious things. She lashed out instinctively, her fist arcing toward him with mountain-shattering force. But he deflected the blow with gentle precision before stepping into her space and wrapping his arms around her. He hugged her. The simple gesture carried more power than any spell, more authority than any domain technique. In that moment, surrounded by the devastation of her own making, Rin felt something she had thought lost forever. Unconditional acceptance. So I'll save you, Rin Ashbluff, Arthur whispered, his voice low and steady with unshakable promise. And I'll teach you how to love again. Rin let out a sound that was half growl and half sob, miasma erupting from her in a final desperate surge that chipped away at Arthur's protective aura. The sheer force of her anguish made his gray crown flicker while fragments of light fell like embers around them. Arthur warped space instantly, retreating just far enough to avoid being consumed while maintaining the connection between them. His breathing had grown heavier, his domain flickering ever so slightly as the sustained use of gray power pushed even his enhanced capabilities toward their limits. More? He murmured, scratching his cheek with a gesture that belied the growing strain visible in his movements. I can't keep this up indefinitely. He wasn't lying to himself. The only reason he could maintain such overwhelming superiority was because of his domain and the gray power it allowed him to access. But even that transcendent force had limitations when channeled through someone who hadn't yet reached true Radiant rank. Still, he pressed on. This wasn't a battle he could afford to lose. Not for himself, but for the girl whose soul hung in the balance. Come on, Rin, Arthur called out, his voice carrying calm determination despite his obvious exhaustion. Let it all out. Every last bit of pain and rage and despair. I'll take it all. Rin snarled, her miasma swirling around her like a living entity that sought to devour everything within reach. Yet beneath the storm of corruption, her gaze wavered for the briefest moment. Her attacks continued with relentless fury, but there was hesitation now, doubt creeping in where absolute certainty had once reigned. Something fragile and precious was fighting against the all-consuming hunger that had defined her existence for so long. Arthur smiled faintly, his gray aura burning brighter as he prepared for the final phase of their confrontation. "I'll save you," he repeated, more to himself than to her, "even if it costs me everything I have." Chapter 819. Rin Ashbluff. 5. I never wanted to hurt anyone in my life. The memory surfaced unbidden as I continued my relentless assault against Arthur, each strike carrying the weight of years of accumulated anguish. I had been 3 years old when I made that promise, standing in the sunlit gardens of the Ashbluff estate with the unwavering confidence that only a child could possess. "I'll never hurt anyone," I had declared to my parents and Jean, my small fists clenched as though the gesture could bind the universe itself to honor my words. The conviction in my voice had made even my father smile, that rare expression of warmth that he reserved for moments when his children reminded him why ruling was worthwhile. My mother had knelt down to embrace me, her warmth wrapping around me like the gentlest magic. "My sweet Rin," she had whispered, her voice carrying all the love a parent could hold. Father's strong hand had ruffled my hair with unexpected tenderness, his deep voice rumbling with pride and affection as he spoke. "That's a noble promise, little princess." I had been loved. Completely, unconditionally, absolutely loved. As the princess of the Western continent, I had been adored not just by my family, but by the people who saw in me hope for a brighter future. I had basked in that love, in the certainty that I could make the world better through compassion and strength guided by righteousness. The approaching awakening ceremony had seemed like the first step on a shining path I was destined to walk. "Jean," I had said one afternoon as we played among the enchanted roses of our family's private garden, "when I get my gift, I'll make sure there's no more crime in our kingdom. I'll make the world safe for everyone who can't protect themselves." Jean, always quieter and more thoughtful than his exuberant sister, had nodded with solemn certainty. "I'll help you," he had replied simply, and those 3 words had filled me with such joy that I had laughed with pure delight. When the awakening ceremony finally arrived, I could barely contain my excitement. Jean had gone first, stepping forward with quiet confidence while magical energy swirled around him in patterns that spoke to powerful potential awakening within his young form. The appraiser's announcement had filled the room with pride and celebration. "The gift of Necromancer's touch," he had declared with obvious pleasure. The satisfaction radiating from Father had been almost tangible, his approval clear in every aspect of his posture as he placed a firm hand on Jin's head. I had clapped and cheered, my heart swelling with happiness for my beloved brother and anticipation for my own moment of transformation. Then it had been my turn. I had stepped forward eagerly, my chest tight with excitement and nervous energy. The ritual had begun normally enough, magical power rushing through my small body in waves that felt like liquid starlight. At first, it had been exhilarating, a flood of potential that made me feel like I could fly. But then something had gone wrong. The energy that should have been warm and welcoming turned caustic, burning through my veins like acid. Pain beyond anything my young mind could process had torn through my body, making me gasp and clutch at my chest while the world seemed to blur around me. "It hurts?" I had thought desperately, panic rising as the agony intensified beyond all reason. "Why does it hurt so much?" The room had grown darker, shadows creeping in from corners that shouldn't have existed, while a suffocating presence pressed against my consciousness. And then I had felt it, something alien and hungry stirring within my mind, whispering words I didn't understand in voices that made my soul recoil. When I had opened my eyes, there had been blood everywhere. The appraiser had stumbled backward, clutching wounds that had appeared across his chest without warning. My father's voice had boomed through the chamber, but the words had seemed distant and distorted. Worst of all, my thoughts were no longer entirely my own. "Kill. Kill them. Their threats. Kill them all." "No!" I had screamed silently, trying to fight the alien voice that had invaded my mind, but it had been relentless in its hunger for destruction. "They fear you now. They'll try to hurt you. Protect yourself. Kill them first." "Rin!" Father's voice had broken through the haze of corruption, and I had felt his manna wrapping around me like iron chains. But when I had tried to speak, to tell him I was sorry, my mouth had moved on its own. Kill! I had hissed, my voice warped and inhuman. Sleep! Father had whispered desperately, pouring his will into the command with enough force to render unconscious most beings below radiant rank. I had collapsed to the floor as enforced slumber claimed me, the last thing I saw being my mother's tear-streaked face as she reached toward me with hands that trembled with heartbreak. When consciousness had returned, I had found myself alone in darkness. The room that became my prison had been comfortable enough. Elegant furniture, amenities, even enchanted windows that provided illusions of outdoor views. But the seals etched into every surface had made the space feel like a tomb. Their constant presence a reminder that I was no longer trusted to exist freely among the people I loved. The days had blurred into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years. Father had visited regularly at first, his manna reinforcing the barriers that kept me contained while his face maintained careful neutrality. But I could see the strain in his eyes, could feel the way each renewal sapped his strength a little more. Why? I had thought bitterly during the darkest moments. Why does he keep wasting himself on me? The voice in my head had never truly left. It whispered constantly, growing stronger as I grew older, offering solutions that made my heart sick with revulsion. Kill them before they kill you. They keep you caged like an animal. End their suffering and yours. I had fought it every day, every hour, every minute. But the black manna had been patient, gnawing at my sanity like water wearing away stone. Some days, the temptation to simply give in had been almost overwhelming. There had been moments when I had considered ending everything myself. I had tried once, throwing my body against the sealed walls with all the strength I could muster. The barriers had held firm, and I had crumpled to the floor in sobbing despair. Even death had been denied to me. How cruel, I had thought in the aftermath. I wanted to help people. I wanted to protect them. But the corruption had transformed me into the very thing my younger self would have sworn to fight against. I had thought of Mother's warmth, of Father's hidden tenderness, of Jin's quiet loyalty and love. They deserved none of the pain my existence had brought them. They deserved a daughter and sister who could stand at their side rather than a monster who had to be locked away from the world. I hadn't wanted to hurt them. I had never wanted to hurt anyone. But deep in my heart, I had known the truth. Eventually, the seals would fail. The black manna would consume what remained of my human consciousness, and I would destroy the very people I loved most in all the world. Now, as I fought against Arthur in this mental battlefield, those same thoughts tormented me. Every strike I threw carried the weight of that accumulated despair. Every spell I cast was powered by years of self-hatred and desperate longing for peace. You? Why? I gasped, my voice trembling as exhaustion finally began to overtake the corruption's fury. My mental form should have been stronger here, should have been able to regenerate endlessly, yet somehow I felt utterly drained. Arthur stood before me wreathed in gray light, his presence impossibly steady despite the chaos I had unleashed. He wasn't fighting to kill me, even though that would have been the mercy I had begged for. No, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was refusing to give up on me. My hope, I thought desperately, feeling that cruel emotion beginning to stir in the depths of my consciousness. Don't do this to me. Don't make me hope. Kill me? I rasped, my voice raw and broken with years of accumulated anguish. Please, just end this nightmare. But Arthur didn't respond with violence. Instead, he stepped forward with the same careful determination he had shown throughout our battle. No. No. Stop. Don't come closer. Before I could retreat, his arms wrapped around me in an embrace that carried warmth beyond anything I had felt since childhood. His strength radiated through the contact, not just physical power, but something far more overwhelming. It wasn't dominance or conquest. It was acceptance. I told you, he whispered, his voice low but resonant with unshakable conviction. I'll save you. The world around me began to blur as tears I hadn't known I could still shed spilled down my cheeks. the battlefield of my own making started to dissolve. The storm of black mana that had raged within me for so long finally beginning to quiet in the face of something I had thought lost forever. Unconditional love. I gasped as the last traces of the mental realm dissolved into peaceful darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of his promise. I'll save you. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe that salvation might actually be possible. Chapter 820. Rin Ashbluff. 6. I exhaled slowly as the battle within Rin's mindscape finally reached its conclusion. The storm of corrupted mana that had defined her existence for 17 years gradually subsiding into something approaching peace. Her mental form rested limply in my embrace. The fierce energy that had driven her toward destruction now reduced to exhausted silence. Stubborn girl. I thought with a mixture of affection and exasperation. Even when I had entered her mind with the express purpose of healing her, Rin's first instinct had been to redirect my efforts toward killing her. Not out of selfishness or cowardice, but from grim resolve to protect the world from the devastation she feared she would inevitably cause. She had even attempted to manipulate our mental battle, trying to force me into delivering a killing blow that would render her brain dead while sparing everyone beyond her prison walls. It was the kind of selfless sacrifice that would have made her younger self proud, even as it broke my heart to witness. But she had underestimated both my determination and my capabilities. I hadn't come here to destroy her. I had come to save her, regardless of what that salvation might cost me personally. I still have enough mana, I noted with relief, feeling the reserves of power that remained available to me. The strength I had expended during our confrontation existed only within the mental realm, sparing my physical body from the toll of extended combat. That was crucial because what came next would require every ounce of power I could muster. Closing my eyes, I called upon my third gift with careful precision. Mythweaver. The moment it activated, I felt the familiar sensation of reality becoming malleable beneath my will. Mythweaver didn't just rewrite stories or alter narratives. It could reshape fundamental truths, taking the fabric of existence and reforming it according to patterns that defied conventional understanding. And now it would rewrite Rin's very nature. I looked down at her unconscious form, noting how peaceful she appeared when freed from the constant torment of warring magical forces. Her gift of duality wasn't inherently evil. It was simply unstable, a volatile fusion of mana and miasma that no human consciousness was equipped to handle safely. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. If one gift containing both forces was too dangerous, then I would create two separate gifts that could coexist without driving their bearer toward madness. In the mental space of her consciousness, I reached out with Mythweaver's reality-altering power. The gift of duality shimmered within her core like a chaotic star, its energies swirling in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Light and shadow, creation and destruction, order and entropy, all locked in eternal conflict within the confines of a single magical framework. Gently, I touched the gift's structure with my enhanced perception, feeling the threads of its existence beneath my fingers. Mythweaver sang with anticipation as I began the delicate work of unraveling what had never been meant to exist in the first place. The process required surgical precision. I carefully separated the intertwined energies, pulling apart the mana from the miasma while maintaining the essential characteristics that made each force powerful in its own right. They resisted at first, fighting to remain connected through bonds forged by years of mutual dependence. But Mythweaver's authority was absolute within the realm of possibility. Slowly, methodically, I divided duality into its component elements. The mana portion reformed itself into something radiant and stable, pulsing with controlled power that spoke to healing and protection. The miasma crystallized into a separate gift entirely, its destructive potential contained within structures that would respond to conscious will rather than mindless hunger. When the work was complete, I felt the fundamental change ripple through Rin's entire being. Where once a single unstable gift had torn her consciousness apart, now two balanced powers existed in harmony, distinct but complementary, powerful but controlled. Rin's mental form stirred in my arms as the transformation took hold. The lines of pain and fury that had marked her features for so long began to fade, replaced by an expression of genuine peace that I hadn't seen since her childhood memories. "It's done," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely certain she could hear me in her current state. "You're free now, Rin. The war inside you is over." I opened my eyes in the physical world, blinking against the sudden transition from mental landscape to material reality. My body felt extraordinarily heavy, every muscle protesting even the slightest movement as the toll of using Mythweaver at such an intensive level finally caught up with me. Beside me, Rin began to stir. Her breathing, which had been erratic and shallow throughout her imprisonment, settled into the steady rhythm of natural sleep. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment she simply stared at me with an expression of profound confusion. "Rin," I said softly, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat up with tentative movements, as though testing her own body for the first time in years. Her hands moved to her chest, pressing against the place where her magical core resided, and I watched her eyes widen as she felt the change within herself. Then, without warning, she turned toward me and threw her arms around my neck with desperate intensity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotions too complex for simple words. "Thank you, my hero." The raw gratitude in her tone caught me completely off guard. She pulled back just enough to look at me directly, tears streaming down her face while her dark eyes shone with something I hadn't seen in any of her memories. Genuine hope. "You didn't give up on me," she continued, her voice breaking with accumulated relief. "Even when I gave up on myself. Even when I begged you to kill me. Even when everyone else would have said I was beyond saving." I smiled weakly, raising a trembling hand to ruffle her hair in the gesture I had seen her father make in happier times. "Told you I'd save you, didn't I?" The sound of approaching footsteps drew our attention as Rin's family entered the chamber. Valen moved with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usual commanding presence subdued by 17 years of guilt and desperate hope. Camilla followed close behind, her hands pressed to her mouth as tears flowed freely down her cheeks. Jean came last, his composed demeanor cracking as he saw his sister truly awake and aware for the first time since childhood. Valen was the first to reach us, his powerful frame trembling as he knelt beside the bed. For a moment, he simply stared at Rin as though afraid she might disappear if he looked away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Rin, is it really you?" "Father?" she replied simply, the word carrying 17 years of longing and forgiveness. Valen's composure shattered completely. The man who had ruled a continent through sheer force of will broke down as he pulled his daughter into an embrace that spoke to every sleepless night and impossible choice he had endured for her sake. Camilla joined them moments later, her arms encircling both husband and daughter, while she whispered words of love and relief that had been building in her heart for nearly 2 decades. Jean hung back for a moment, uncertainty clear in his expression, before Rin extended one hand toward him with a tearful smile. "Brother," she said, and Jin's careful control evaporated as he rushed to join the family embrace. Watching their reunion filled me with satisfaction that went beyond any victory I had achieved in physical combat. This was what made everything worthwhile, not the power I had gained or the recognition I had earned, but the simple act of restoring what had been broken. Valen turned toward me, his face still streaked with tears, and I could see him struggling to find words adequate for what I had accomplished. "What did you do?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. How is this possible?" I leaned back against the wall, every movement requiring tremendous effort as exhaustion weighed down my limbs like lead. "Her gift," I began slowly, my words coming with difficulty. Duality was the problem. 2 opposing forces trying to exist within a single framework. It was tearing her apart from the inside. And, Valen pressed, though his tone carried understanding rather than impatience. "So I split it," I explained, managing a faint smile despite my condition. 2 separate gifts now. One for mana, one for miasma. Distinct but stable. She can use both safely without them driving her toward madness. Valen's eyes widened as the implications sank in. You rewrote the fundamental nature of her magical development. Something like that, I confirmed, though the effort of speaking was becoming increasingly difficult. Camila looked at me with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made my chest tighten with emotion. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving us our daughter back."